I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight I'm here to remind you that sometimes the safest drink on the medieval table was the murkiest one in the barrel. Odd, isn't it, how the very liquid that smelled of swamp water could mean the difference between life and a nasty death by contaminated well. Picture a bucket of rainwater laced with frog spawn, a muddy patch of rye left to bubble and hiss in the corner of a dirt floor cottage, and a mother shushing her crying baby with a sip of sour ale instead of water. Why? Because water in many medieval villages was a gamble. Small beer, on the other hand, was the peasant's insurance policy. It was weak, yes, but it boiled, fermented, and fought off invisible threats no eye could see. If a little fermented trivia helps you drift off better than counting sheep, consider tapping that like button, no tavern brawl required. And if you're feeling generous, pour yourself a subscribe too. Ever wondered what your ancestors would brew up if they rummaged through your modern fridge? Leave a soft, sleepy thought below. I'd love to know what questionable homebrew you'd ferment in a pinch. Now, settle under your blanket, pull your thoughts away from tomorrow's chores, and follow me back into a world of muddy barrels and sour dreams. You stand barefoot on packed earth, the smell of stale grain thick in the air. It's early dawn. Your village is quiet, except for the distant clatter of a rooster announcing that another day of toil has begun. But before anyone swings a scythe or carries firewood, the first task for many medieval peasants is not bread or porridge, it's checking the ale barrel. In a time when clean wells were unreliable and streams ran brown with runoff from neighboring farms, the average peasant family couldn't risk the gamble. Boiling water for tea, a luxury not yet common. Boiling mash for beer, though now that was survival. Historians still argue whether this constant brewing was a conscious strategy or a desperate habit passed down by trial and error. Either way, it worked. Some mornings, you'd find the household's eldest crouched over a wooden cask, testing the cloudy liquid with a taste so practiced they'd know if fermentation had gone foul. If it had no one dared waste it, bad beer could be reboiled, mixed with fresh mash, or if truly horrific, fed to pigs. Nothing went unused. This thrifty cycle of reuse defined medieval brewing at the peasant level. And oh, what odd things ended up in those barrels. Imagine stale loaves crumbled in the dry crusts, giving a second life as a bubbling mash. Leftover porridge scraps foraged nettles, and when times were rough, weeds pulled from the garden, anything with the faintest hint of starch or sugar found its way into the brew. Some families even dried wildflowers and seeds to coax out more flavor, or rumor had it a stronger kick. Modern beer lovers might turn up their noses at such sloppy recipes. After all, today's craft breweries boast shiny copper kettles and sterile stainless steel tanks. But in the mud floor cottages of your average medieval hamlet, the tools were simpler. A big clay pot for mashing a cloth to strain the grains, and a barrel, if you were lucky enough to own one, that didn't leak at the seams. The term small beer often confuses modern ears. It wasn't small in volume. Peasants drank gallons of the stuff. Every week, it was small in strength. Less alcohol, just enough to kill off dangerous microbes, but safe for children to sip with breakfast. Some records even hint at toddlers being given watered ale as early as weaned a practice that would horrify a modern parent, but seemed sensible when rivers ran foul. There's no scholarly consensus on whether small beer truly kept children healthier in the long run. Records are sparse, diseases plentiful, but the folk logic was stubborn, better a drunk child than a dead one. Strange comfort that. You can almost hear the quiet burble of yeast at work if you listen long enough. Some villagers claimed they could tell by the gurgle if a batch would be sweet or sour. Of course, this was more superstition than science, yet who could blame them? The difference between a drinkable barrel and a rank, moldy mess could mean empty bellies and parched throats. In winter, brewing got trickier. Cold temperatures slowed the yeast, sometimes freezing barrels solid in poorly insulated huts. Then came spring's thaw, and the rush to finish stale batches before they spoiled entirely. Festive or not, the peasants' relationship with ale was purely practical. Keep the family hydrated, stretch the grain until the next harvest, and pray the next batch didn't turn to vinegar overnight. No brewing guilds watched over these humble folk. Those came later with towns and taxes. Out here in the countryside, brewing knowledge passed from one cracked mug to the next, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor. Mistakes were common. Exploding barrels were legendary. Yet the cycle continued ferment drink repeat, generation after generation. What surprises modern historians most is how casually peasants treated the constant low-level drunkenness that came with small beer. It didn't produce rowdy tavern songs at dawn, just a soft haze that took the edge off daily hunger and endless toil. A plowman might pause mid-field, lean on his wooden handle, and sip from a jug slung at his belt, then trudge on until sunset. Picture yourself back inside that cottage. Morning has turned to dusk. A single candle flickers near the barrel. A child drowses beside the hearth, his lips sticky with the last sip of the day's brew. Tomorrow the cycle repeats. Mash the stale grain, stir the weeds, pray the yeast does its quiet bubbling magic once more. And so you drift with them into a time where muddy barrels and sour dreams were not just history, but survival in every cup. A thin dawn mist settles over your village as you step outside, mug in hand, savoring the sour tang of last night's brew. If your batch passed muster, you're in luck. No fines today. But should your ale taste too weak, or your barrel stink of mold, you'd best hope no one reports you to the ale tasters. Yes, you heard that right. In medieval towns across Europe, entire ordinances policed what commoners brewed behind thatch and timber. Laws scrawled on brittle parchment set rules for how strong your ale had to be when it could be sold, and how clean your brewing equipment must stay. Fail the test, you'd pay a fine, lose your brewing rights, or worse, earn the scorn of neighbors who'd rather risk bad water than your sour swill. Some historians argue these laws were more about taxes than taste every mug poured meant coins for the local lord or town treasury. Others point out that ale was daily bread in liquid form. Too weak and laborers flagged in the fields. Too filthy and illness spread like wildfire. Surviving town rolls show inspectors called ale tasters walking door to door, unannounced dipping fingers into barrels, sniffing for mold, and taking loud theatrical sips. You watch as an ale taster steps into your neighbor's yard, his cloak dusted with morning dew, his expression part judge, part village gossip. His job earns him more free drinks than any bard could hope for. But it's not without risk. Anger the wrong brewer, and you might find your mug laced with something foul next round. There are tales whispered late at night of bribes hidden in bread loaves or coins slipped between tankards. One unlucky ale taster in York found his shoes nailed to his doorstep as a warning test fair or test elsewhere. Researchers still debate whether these inspectors genuinely kept towns safe from spoiled ale, or simply padded local coffers under the guise of public health. Rules differed from village to village. In some corners of England, fines fell heavy for selling weak ale considered a swindle equal to watering down a neighbor's harvest. In bustling market towns, fines could cripple a family's winter income if barrels failed inspection during peak festival days. On the flip side, ale tasters could earn a modest living free drinks aside because every infraction meant fresh coins for the Lord's purse. Step back into your own timber cottage for a moment. Imagine you've spent hours stirring mash over a smoky hearth, carefully straining grain through rough cloth tasting and adjusting with a pinch of herbs. Now picture that one careless slip, a forgotten stir, a draft that cooled your mash too soon, and you're on the hook for a penalty you can't afford. Mothers, widows, young apprentices, anyone could find themselves suddenly a brewer if it meant filling empty mugs. Brewing was often women's work, woven into daily chores, alongside bread baking and cloth dyeing. Yet when the ale taster came knocking, the whole household waited breathless as he dipped a spoon into the cask. If your brew pleased him, he'd nod mark his roll and shuffle off to the next door a free pint richer. If not, he'd tally your fine sometimes in coin, sometimes in kind. And neighbors would gossip for weeks about your sorry brewing skills. Historians still piece together scraps of these ordinances scrawled in Latin or Middle English, revealing tiny village economies balanced on the bubbles of fermenting mash. Picture a market square on inspection day. Wooden stalls creak under baskets of eggs and bundles of herbs, but all eyes drift to the ale taster weaving through the crowd. He's part judge, part street performer. Every sniff and sip is theater. Children giggle at the sour faces he pulls. Old men cheer when a fine is handed down to a neighbor they envy. One written account from a small Yorkshire village describes an ale taster so loved for his fair rulings that he received fresh bread and cheese for life, provided he never fined the baker's wife for weak ale again. Of course, not all townsfolk found him so charming. Some saw him as a meddler, an excuse for the Lord to squeeze more coins from already thin purses. Others whispered that fines funded feasts for officials rather than fixing leaky town wells or mending muddy roads. Scholars disagree on how much truth sits behind these rumors, but records of repeat offenders suggest plenty found ways to dodge inspections altogether. A clever brewer might hide a stronger barrel in the back shed for trusted neighbors, doling out mild ale for the ale taster's nose. Others time their brewing for days when inspectors were too busy or too drunk to bother. There's even talk of entire hamlets that pooled fines together. If one house got caught, everyone pitched in, ensuring no family went hungry for lack of beer money. Step closer to the village inn now, its timber beams sagging under a thatched roof, blackened by decades of smoky hearths. Here the ale taster sometimes paused his rounds to swap gossip with the local landlord. Stories traded for mugs, whose daughter wed, whose grain harvest failed, whose barrels ran suspiciously dry just as taxes came due. If you sit by the hearth, you might hear the low hum of villagers discussing the next inspection, passing secrets about where the best, strongest ale flows. Somewhere between the flicker of firelight and the soft clink of clay mugs, you glimpse a truth as old as brewing itself. When drink is survival, and survival is taxed, even the humblest peasant learns to brew and bend the rules. Tomorrow, the ale taster will return. Maybe he'll smile at your barrel, praise your frothy brew, and leave you in peace. Or maybe he'll wag a finger, scratch a fine onto his parchment, and remind you that in this muddy corner of history, the smallest cask holds power enough to feed or starve your kin. So you sip your weak ale, swirl the sour tang around your tongue, and wonder if tomorrow's brew will pass the test or buy you a fresh story whispered among neighbors long after the ale taster has shuffled down the road. If you think a simple mug of medieval ale was just barley and water, think again. You find yourself leaning over a battered barrel, peering at a mash that looks more like a forest floor than a brewer's dream. Bitter herbs float on top yarrow heather, maybe a stray nettle or two, and a swirl of crushed seeds drifts through the froth. Welcome to the world of questionable additives, where flavor potency and strange side effects all swirl together in the same wooden cask. Brewing in the Middle Ages was rarely a neat recipe passed down on parchment. It was part folk magic, part kitchen experiment, and part desperate improvisation. The grains were never enough poor soil, harsh weather, greedy landlords, so peasants foraged for ways to stretch every batch. Some threw in handfuls of mugwort, once prized for its bitterness. Others snuck in wild hops, long before hops became the standard for beer. But not every herb stayed within the realm of mild flavoring. Stories persist of narcotic weeds, henbane belladonna, finding their way into local brews. Some historians argue these tales are mostly myth, whispered by nervous monks to keep villagers from turning brewing into low-level alchemy. But surviving legal records hint at crackdowns on herbed ale that made drinkers drowsy, giddy, or worse. You dip your cup and swirl it under your nose. Imagine the pungent smell of rosemary mixed with damp grain and an earthy whiff of something you can't quite place. Would you drink it? For many peasants, there wasn't a choice. When clean water was scarce and weak, beer was the norm. Any attempt to make it taste less like muddy straw was worth the risk. An odd pinch of spice cloves, cinnamon imported if you were lucky, could lift a brew from bland to almost festive. But such exotic extras rarely trickled down to farmhands and field workers. Instead, the flavor came from what the forest and hedgerows offered: roots bark, even a sprinkle of dried fungi. Some villagers swore certain mushrooms gave a mild buzz. Whether true or the result of wishful thinking, scholars still argue today. Brewing manuals were rare treasures, mostly locked in monastery libraries or the hands of wealthy guild brewers in big towns. For everyone else, it was rumor and word of mouth. Aunt Marjorie down the lane knew which weeds added zest without making your stomach turn. Old Giles in the next hamlet mixed in something he claimed kept ale from spoiling too fast, though more than one neighbor claimed his barrels brought strange dreams. There's a curious charm in picturing a village mother rummaging in a hedgerow for handfuls of ground ivy or wild rosemary to toss into the brewpot. And yet with each handful came a gamble enough to flavor, not enough to sicken. Local lore says some tavern keepers grew secret herb gardens behind creaking doors, patches of sage juniper berries, and stranger greens that made drinkers swear the ale warmed the bones more than the bland town brew. By the flicker of your hearth's fire, you watch steam rise from the bubbling pot. A neighbor leans in, sniffing. He wagers you've added too much wormwood this time, too bitter, he claims, and folks will wrinkle their noses. But too little, and no one will pay an extra coin for your batch at the seasonal fair. It's a delicate dance, and the stakes are simple flavor that lures thirsty laborers away from the competition. Sometimes the line between brewing and medicine blurred. A handful of bitter herbs could double as a fever-cure good ale that soothed a cough or dulled an aching back was prized. You'd hear whispers of village healers who slipped poppy seeds or valerian root into a small cask, then sold cups for a penny more. Was it a drink or a potion? Surviving records leave it unclear, and some scholars remain puzzled by the true recipes lost to time. Children watched all this from the shadows eyes wide as mothers dropped dried petals or mashed roots into the pot. They'd learn which plants to pick, which to fear, and how to taste the brew with caution. Tales linger of entire families falling ill after a careless handful of the wrong leaf. But for every mishap, dozens more batches fizzed away safely in the corner, filling the cottage with the soft, sour scent of everyday survival. Step outside your homebrew cottage for a moment. The village path is lined with gossiping neighbors, swapping secrets about who brews the strongest, whose batch turned strange shades of green last spring, and who might be mixing in things best left to the local healer's shelf. Word travels faster than any official ale taster. Bad brew shames a house for weeks. A good one might earn you trade favors, a warm loaf, or a secret nod from the blacksmith next door. In bigger towns, brewing guilds began sniffing out this rustic chaos. They didn't trust backyard brewers, tossing who knows what into barrels. Guild rules hardened standard recipes, licensed ingredients, official brewing days. But far from city walls, your average peasant carried on improvising, stirring a pot that blurred the line between farm chore and village experiment. So tonight, you swirl your cup, taste the bitter tang, and wonder, did the villagers truly see visions after a mug too many? Or did the long days in the fields, the empty bellies, and the swirl of rumor ferment those hallucinations more than any hidden herb ever could? There's no definitive answer, just whispers buried under centuries of turned soil and forgotten barrels. But for now, your mug is warm in your hands, the taste oddly sharp, but comforting in the cold dawn light. And somewhere in that swirl of roots and grain drifts a fragment of the old world's genius. When life gave you weeds and stale bread, you turned them into a drink. Questionable, unpredictable, but yours all the same. A breath of wood smoke clings to your cloak as you push open the warped timber door of a village tavern. It's a squat building, half hidden under a thatched roof, heavy with moss and decades of gossip. Inside, the air hums with warmth, clinking mugs, and the low buzz of voices that weave together in a tapestry thicker than the smoke that coils above the hearth. Rustic taverns like this were the heartbeat of medieval social life, places where muddy boots scuffed rush-covered floors, where secrets changed hands over pints of thin ale, or mugs of mead sweet enough to trick your tongue into forgetting yesterday's hunger. Not every peasant could afford to brew at home. Barley might run out of barrel, might leak, or a harsh winter might rot your stash of grain. When that happened, the tavern offered more than a drink. It offered an escape from the monotony of survival. A flickering hearth, a bench near the door, a mug clutched close. It was a borrowed comfort when your own cottage felt too cold or too quiet. It's here in the shadows of timber beams, blackened by centuries of soot, that you'd overhear everything worth knowing. Who owed who for a barrel last harvest, who planned to marry off a daughter for a dowry of 6 chickens and 2 pigs, who had brewed a batch so strong last winter that 3 laborers ended up face down in the snow before dawn. Historians still debate whether taverns were the great equalizers of medieval life, or just another stage for the same old peasant hierarchies to flex in plain view. Near the hearth sits the landlord, or sometimes the alewife, her sleeves rolled, her sharp eye tracking who drank how much, and who slipped a coin across the table without paying full measure. In many hamlets, women ran these smoky rooms, filling mugs from barrels hidden behind thick drapes or in low cellars that smelled of damp earth and stale yeast. Picture the battered barrels stacked in a dark corner. Some smell faintly sweet mead, made from honey combed from hives tucked behind village hedgerows. Others reek of sour mash, thin and watery, but still safer than the stream outside. And somewhere in a clay jug, tucked under the counter, a stronger brew sloshes a sip reserved for travelers who slip an extra penny across the counter. It's no grand inn, with feather beds and roasts turning on a spit. No, your local tavern is closer to an extension of every home in the village. Children sometimes curl up on benches, while parents whisper deals and debts by candlelight. Local scribes might scratch IOUs onto bits of birch bark or torn parchment, hoping the landlord's memory holds true when spring comes and taxes loom. Every so often, the hush breaks into laughter. A woodcutter brags about how he tricked the ale taster last week, mixed weak ale with the dregs of last season's cider, and passed inspection with a wink. His friends cackle mugs clinking until the landlord shoots them a look that says, "Laugh all you want, just don't spill secrets that bring fines to my door." Home brewing didn't stop at the tavern door. Many villagers kept small barrels tucked behind kitchen hearths, an insurance policy when the tavern's cask ran dry, or the landlord's price jumped before a festival. Children carried jugs back and forth under shawls, slipping through muddy lanes with errands disguised as chores. In cramped kitchens, barrels leaned beside bread ovens, sharing space with sacks of grain and bundles of dried herbs that lent each household brew its own signature twist. Researchers continue to debate how much of this homebrew made its way back to the tavern. Some landlords cut deals, buy the neighbor's surplus, pass it off as their own mark up the price a penny or two. Others turned a blind eye when a regular swapped a mug from home for a bit of tavern warmth. After all, community ties were stronger than guild rules in hamlets where survival hinged on favors traded over a pint. When harvests failed or plague struck, the tavern became more than a place to drink. It was a place to mourn, to plan to hope the next season would bring fatter pigs, healthier fields, or a better batch of ale. In good years, it echoed with songs that rose into the rafters and drifted out into the dark lanes where stray dogs dozed under fences. In bad years, it fell silent except for the soft clink of mugs raised in memory of neighbors lost. A soft anchor point drifts back to your thoughts. Remember that small beer you tasted at dawn. Here it turns to something else entirely, a thin trickle of liquid courage that keeps the cold at bay, while tongues loosen and secrets slip out like mice under a door. Picture yourself perched on a rough bench, back pressed to a timber wall, warmed by dozens of bodies pressed close. Your mug leaves a damp ring on the scarred table. Your breath fogs in the chill that creeps in whenever the door creaks open. Around you, villagers lean in trading rumors about the next ale taster's visit, who might be brewing stronger stuff behind closed shutters, who might be hiding a fresh barrel of mead from the landlord's tax tally. If you listen carefully past the laughter and the low hum of gossip, you might catch a line from an old folk song, drifting between benches, something about barrels that leak more secrets than they hold. And as you drain the last sip, you realize that here, in this smoky cradle of timber and whispers, a simple mug of ale carries more than warmth. It carries the weight of muddy fields, thin harvests, family debts, and the soft, stubborn hope that tomorrow's brew might taste just a little bit sweeter than today's. Outside the tavern, dawn breaks soft and gray. But inside thick stone walls, far from the muddy lanes, other barrels rest in silence. Barrels that promise stronger drink and holier excuses. Monasteries dotted the medieval landscape, like little fortresses of prayer and fermentation, their gardens full of herbs for medicine and brewing alike. For the weary traveler, a knock at the monastery gate might mean shelter soup and a cup of ale richer than any village brew. Step through the wooden doors, your cloak damp from the mist, and follow the hush of sandaled feet down echoing stone corridors. The air smells faintly of beeswax old parchment and the sweet tang of fermenting grain. In one corner, a monk in a plain brown robe stirs a copper kettle steam, rising in lazy ribbons. Here, brewing is not just survival, it's salvation for the soul and coin for the cloister. Some monasteries became local legends for their liquid bread. Strong, nourishing ales fortified the brothers during fasting days, when solid food was forbidden, but hearty drink was not. Historians still argue how strict these fasts really were. Records hint that some monks found holy loopholes in barrels tucked behind chapel doors. A traveler lucky enough to rest his bones at a monastery might wake to the chant of morning prayers and the earthy scent of brewing mash drifting through the cloister. For a few coins or a generous donation to the abbot, he'd leave with a jug tucked in his saddlebag, a taste of stronger ale than any peasant tavern could hope to pour. Monastic brewing wasn't a small operation. Beneath stone arches and stained glass, brothers perfected recipes that made local peasants jealous. While villagers threw stale bread and weeds into rough pots, monks ordered sacks of fine malted grain, experimented with exotic herbs from distant lands, and stored barrels in cool, dark cellars that kept spoilage at bay. You'd think men of faith would sip sparingly, but some monastic diaries suggest otherwise. One entry from a 14th century Benedictine brother jokes about holy hangovers after feast days when too much ale found its way into too many goblets. Researchers continue to debate how honest these writings were, exaggeration or confession, but the image lingers: monks in quiet cloisters, chanting prayers by day, tipping mugs by night. Far beyond the monastery gates, word spread about the good stuff hidden behind those thick walls. Peasants trudged miles to buy a jug, townsfolk carried barrels away on creaking carts, and local taverns sometimes mixed monastic ale into their own watery brews to fool fussy drinkers. In return, the monasteries collected coins that helped keep candle flames flickering, roofs patched, and manuscript pages turned under flickering lamps. The best brew was rarely tasted by common folk for free. A wandering pilgrim might beg for a sip, a poor farmer might trade eggs, or a side of salted pork, but mostly the strong stuff flowed to those who could pay, or those the monks favored. Surviving receipts, ink faded, and corners eaten by mice, hint at debts paid in barrels. Alliances sealed with jugs, and neighbors who found piety in a well-placed keg. Back in the village, you'd hear tales told in taverns about monks who sampled more than they sold. Rumors curled around hearth fires like pipe smoke, a brother who stumbled back to his cell, so tipsy he mistook the garden for his bed, an abbot who turned a blind eye so long as no ale went to waste. Were these stories true, or just the jealous fancies of peasants who wanted to believe their humble backyard brew had competition behind monastery gates? There is no scholarly consensus, just pages of contradictory scribbles, ink blots, and centuries-old jokes buried in the margins of sacred texts. Picture yourself trailing behind a monk as he lowers a bucket into a cool cellar. Rows of barrels stand like silent sentinels, iron bands, holding them tight against the secrets they keep. He draws off a ladle's worth, lifts it to the light slanting through a narrow window slit, and watches the liquid swirl rich and golden. One taste tells him all he needs to know. Good enough for the next guest, good enough to sell, maybe even good enough to share at the brother's own table when the day's prayers have drifted away with the evening bells. Step back outside where the monastery walls catch the rising sun and throw it back in quiet defiance of poverty's shadows beyond the gates. Here, beer isn't just a peasant's hedge against bad water. It's a product, a tradition, and for some, a little loophole in the holy rulebook. And just like the barrels hidden behind thatched cottage doors, these sacred casks bubble with stories too slippery to hold tight. As you walk down the path from the monastery, the distant chant of morning prayers fades behind you. In your hands, a clay jug still warm from the cellar's breath. And with each step back toward your muddy village lanes, you can almost taste how the same humble drink that softened peasant hunger also filled monastery coffers, fueled whispered rumors, and gave a quiet night's comfort to both the faithful and the faithless alike. Out beyond the monastery walls and the timbered taverns waits a different sort of drinking hall. Rougher, louder, more reckless. Follow the muddy track through dense woods, and you'll come upon a clearing where torchlight flickers off rough-hewn beams and the hum of drunken voices leaks into the cold night air. This is the mead hall part village, gathering part raucous court, part brewing den, where oaths were sworn as fast as mugs were emptied. Step inside, and your boots sink into straw, scattered to soak up spilled drink. The air is thick with wood smoke roasted meat, and the sweet, sharp tang of honey wine mead the pride of rural feasts. No weak small beer here. Tonight's drink is strong enough to loosen tongues and knot new bonds between neighbors who might wake tomorrow wondering what exactly they promised over that last brimming horn. Mead halls rose from older traditions. Viking longhouses turned inland and reinvented in scattered English villages. Norse spirit woven into local custom. On feast days, harvest festivals, wedding banquets, midwinter revels, families trudged miles to gather under timber roofs, carrying jugs of cider ale or mead to pool together. One family's bees might sweeten another's barrel. A pig slaughtered by one household became a roast shared by all. Once the feasting started, words flowed like the drink-loud boasts, whispered gossip insults, tucked between laughter and the thud of fists on tabletops. Historians still argue whether these gatherings truly settled debts and disputes, or simply fermented new ones to bubble up again when the mead's warmth wore off. Imagine standing in the shadows near the great hearth cup in hand, watching the village elder raise his mug. He clears his throat, then speaks a pledge to repay borrowed grain by spring, to stand by a neighbor's fence line when a boundary is questioned, to guard a cousin's honor if a marriage soured. Some promises were noble alliances forged to resist greedy lords or settle blood feuds without blades. Others were petty drunken boasts that fizzled out when dawn came and headaches bloomed like weeds in the fields. One surviving parchment from a 13th century manor hints at debts inked at mead hall feasts that outlasted the men who made them sons bound to pay promises their fathers slurred out between swigs. Some scholars remain puzzled by the legal weight these muddy oaths carried in village courts. Were they binding, or just the convenient excuse for neighbors to nudge each other into favors that kept fields plowed, barns mended, and pigs from wandering too far? Some feasts turned rowdy. By the flickering rush lights, rough voices rose in old songs about heroes' harvests, or the sly fox who stole a monk's best goose. Tales drifted across benches how a knight once traded his sword for a barrel of mead, how a farmhand married the landlord's daughter after promising in a mead hall haze to build her the biggest pigsty in 3 parishes. In corners, half lit by flickering tallow candles, smaller knots of drinkers leaned close. Deals were struck, grudges whispered away for the promise of another horn. Once in a while a scuffle flared, someone's tongue, too sharp someone's mug knocked aside. A few blows, a shove into a smoky wall, and then more often than not, laughter again. Tomorrow, fences might still be mended with apologies or broken altogether if the drink soured stubborn tempers instead of smoothing them. Step outside for a moment. Cold night air bites your cheeks, stars scatter overhead. The clearing hums with the bass note of voices, a wild music carried on the breeze. Behind you, the mead hall breathes honey and wood smoke, a living thing in the darkness. Somewhere inside, a minstrel plucks a lute string, spinning a tale of a village hero who once swore an oath on a barrel and repaid it with 3 summers' worth of mead. Not every peasant could afford mead. Honey cost dearly bees, were precious hives easily lost to winter storms or careless hands. Some villages pooled what they could scraps of comb, traded fermented into small batches saved for big moments. When the barrel cracked open, under the thatched roof of the mead hall, it meant the village trusted each other enough to share what little sweetness they'd scraped from hollow tree trunks and woven skeps. And so you sip with them now. Your mug is sticky with honey residue, your fingers warm, despite the draft slipping through gaps in the timber walls. Around you, laughter crests and dips like waves on a muddy sea. Promises drift through the smoke. Some will hold until spring. Others will vanish with the first frost or the next poor harvest. Tomorrow, those same neighbors will stumble back to fields, forests, and frozen streams. But tonight, here in the humming belly of the mead hall, they are bound together by sweet wine, soft boasts, and the ancient hope that a shared drink might make a promise, hold fast, if only for one more season. Slip away from the mead hall's warmth and step into a quieter corner of medieval life, one where barrels and mugs served a purpose stranger than simple merriment. Here, ale was more than drink. It was medicine charm and cure doled out by healers with rough hands and recipes scribbled on scraps of parchment or carried only in the deep folds of memory. Picture a single-room cottage, its thatched roof, low its walls lined with bunches of drying herbs. A woman, maybe a midwife, maybe just the village's best guess at a healer, leans over a bubbling pot, stirring a bitter concoction of stale ale-crushed nettles and a whisper of wormwood. A young mother grips her knees, nearby sweat on her brow, as the healer ladles out a cup meant to dull the ache of childbirth. Historians still puzzle over these ale-based cures. Was it the herbs that worked the magic? The mild alcohol that soothed nerves and dulled pain? Or the ritual itself, an act that gave the patient hope while time and the body did what they would? Beyond childbirth, villagers turned to boozy brews, for fevers that refused to break stomachs, that knotted from spoiled meat, and the ominous chills that signaled a winter cough might turn deadly. A weak ale heated with honey, spiced with cloves, if you could spare them pressed into trembling hands before bed. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Surviving records offer no certainty, just lists of ingredients and doses scribbled in Latin or plain local dialect recipes half lost in the folds of time. Not every remedy was so simple. Some villagers swore by darker brews potions that combined ale with hallucinogenic herbs or ground mushrooms meant to chase away the evil eye. Tales tell of mugs hidden under beds, sipped only when the moon was new, and the village's gossip wagged about curses and spiteful neighbors. Researchers continue to debate whether these recipes truly held power or simply gave frightened souls something tangible to cling to in the dark. You might find yourself hunched by a smoky hearth, watching as a healer's apprentice dips a cloth into a bowl of warm ale, presses it to a farmer's swollen ankle after a tumble in the fields. Or see a toothache soothed with a mouthful of spiced brew, swirled until the gums numbed. In coastal villages, salt and stale ale might be mixed into a poultice for festering wounds sometimes, with a blessing whispered over the steaming bowl for good measure. Even children were no strangers to these boozy cures. A stubborn cough might earn a sip of warmed ale mixed with wildflower honey. A bellyache might be met with a spoonful of ale steeped with chamomile and mint. By modern eyes, it might seem reckless children, sipping what was by any measure alcohol. But to a peasant mother, in a cold cottage, with no apothecary for miles, a spoonful of warmth was better than nothing at all. Of course, there were skeptics then, too. Some parish priests thundered from wooden pulpits about the dangers of mixing faith with folk cures, warning villagers that a trust in ale and herbs should never outrank the healing power of prayer. But behind closed doors, even the priest might accept a mug of hot ale for his own fevered nights. There was comfort in ritual, and the line between blessing and brew blurred easily when the wind howled and illness crept under the door. Not all these recipes survived. Some linger only in the margins of old court rolls mentioned when an unlucky potion turned poison. A few scraps hint at traveling herbalists who swapped tips for brewing up stronger tonics, some with a dash of mead, some with cider, some with potent bitter ale. There is no scholarly consensus on whether these recipes truly cured anything. Yet the stubborn fact remains that for centuries they were made sipped and whispered over by firesides from farmstead to farmstead. Step outside that humble cottage for a moment. The fields stretch dark under a moonlit sky, the village still save for the faint echo of a distant owl. Somewhere, a barrel bubbles quietly in a corner, mash turning sour but useful. Maybe tomorrow it will fill mugs at supper, or maybe it will be measured out, spoon by spoon, to ease the coughs that ripple through the household each winter. For the medieval peasant ale was never just drink. It was a cure when the healer's shelf was bare, a soft promise that not every ache needed to be met with despair. And though some of those old recipes now linger only as footnotes in the scrolls of monks or the fading memories of village scribes, they tell us this: when life pressed hard, even the humblest brew might carry a whisper of hope, however sour, however bitter, however fleeting. Slip back through the village lanes, past the healer's cottage and the echo of old folk cures, and you'll find another unexpected corner of medieval brewing, one ruled not by monks or ale tasters, but by women, with sleeves rolled and barrels stacked in smoky kitchens. Meet the alewives, the backbone of everyday brewing, the unseen force that kept mugs filled and small coins flowing in and out of muddy cottages. Step inside a cramped timber house, duck under low beams, strung with drying herbs. And there she is, an alewife, bent over a steaming mash pot, stirring with a battered wooden paddle slick with decades of use. Her hands are cracked from the hearth's heat, her apron dusted with flour grain, husks clinging like burrs. By dawn, she bakes bread. By dusk, she brews ale. For centuries, these tasks were one and the same. Alewives were so common in medieval towns and hamlets that their presence blurred into the everyday clatter of village life. Brewing was kitchen work, woven into the daily grind of feeding families and tending gardens. When you boiled grain for porridge in the morning, you might set aside a portion to bubble into a thin ale by nightfall. Waste nothing. Turn scraps to brew. Stale bread to mash. Rinse the cloth. Start again tomorrow. Historians still debate how much power these women truly held. Some argue the brewing bench was a rare seat of economic independence for peasant women, an occupation that brought in precious coins or barter goods when fields yielded little and husbands labored elsewhere. Others point out that the moment brewing turned truly profitable men muscled in forming guilds that stamped out women's informal trade under the guise of quality control. Step closer to the warm hearth where an alewife and her daughters swap gossip while straining fresh brew through cloths hung over big clay jugs. Listen to the soft chatter whose batch turned sour and who added too much mugwort last feast, whose neighbor borrowed grain and forgot to repay, whose fines to the ale taster stung the worst. In England's market towns, brewing was so dominated by women that early town records are dotted with fines and inspections addressed almost entirely to alewives. A sour batch or watered-down jug might earn a sharp rap on the door and a line on the official parchment. Surviving rolls from Norwich and York speak of women hauled before local courts for selling short pints or dodging tax pennies. Some paid their dues with barrels, others with coins, some with whispered deals made behind the ale taster's back. Rumors swirled around alewives, too. Unmarried women who brewed alone widows, who held the rights to a prized brewing bench, neighbors who claimed the strongest ales, hid secrets, narcotic herbs, charms for fertility, or blessings to keep barrels from souring. Some scholars remain puzzled by just how quickly brewing's reputation turned. Once men organized guilds, suddenly alewives were painted with suspicion whispered about as careless or cunning as witches in waiting with bubbling pots in dark corners. Picture a village street on market day. Stalls sag under baskets of vegetables, bolts of rough wool, and here and there, clay jugs for sale brewed last week in someone's back kitchen, now hawked to laborers who need a drink before trudging home. Alewives call out soft bargains, pinch coins, wrap mugs in scraps of cloth for travelers. Behind them, husbands might scowl or grin, but no one mistakes who holds the paddle and the purse strings, at least for now. Change comes slow, but steady. Taxes grow heavier. Guilds tighten their grip. Brewing shifts from the smoky hearth to the tidy back rooms of licensed taverns run by men with official seals and tidy ledgers. Some alewives adapt merry into brewing families or hand off recipes to sons who join the guilds and keep the coins flowing. Others fade into local folklore ghosts with wooden paddles, guardians of secret recipes that slip through village gossip like vapor off a steaming mash pot. Step back inside that cramped cottage one last time. The alewife wipes sweat from her brow, dips a clay mug into a fresh barrel, and tests the taste with a practiced sip. She knows every bitter note, every sweet trace of leftover honey, every whisper of herbs that might stretch the batch just one day longer. Outside, children chase chickens through the mud. Neighbors gather to trade idle talk, and a husband drags firewood to keep the mash warm through the night. Tomorrow, she'll haul this barrel to the tavern down the lane, trade half for coins, and save half for loyal neighbors who'll slip through her door at dusk with empty mugs and hushed thanks. And though taxes and guild rules creep closer for tonight, at least the brewing bench is hers alone, a hearthside kingdom built not on parchment and seals, but on steam patience and the quiet magic that turns scraps to warmth when winter winds rattle the shutters. So, lift your mug, warm your hands around the clay, and remember the alewives, keepers of homebrew secrets, mothers of muddy barrels, and the quiet queens of every rustic brew that kept hunger at bay, and village voices humming deep into the dark. The night air hums with distant laughter and a low, steady rhythm of boots tapping on packed earth. Follow that sound past the flickering rushlights of the tavern and the shadows of the alewife's cottage, and you'll find a ragged figure leaning against the doorpost, lute slung over one shoulder mug, half empty in a calloused hand. Meet the traveling minstrel bard gossip freeloader and walking brewer's best friend or worst nightmare. Minstrels were the lifeblood of many village knights, spinning tales in exchange for coins, a warm corner by the hearth, or simply a refill of whatever brew bubbled in the landlord's best barrel. One night it might be a tale of Arthur's knights chasing shadows through a misty forest. Another, a ribald ballad about a drunken lord who mistook his neighbor's pig for a prize boar and promised its weight in silver. Historians still argue how much truth ever hid in these tavern tales. Some songs stitched real rumors into wild exaggerations, nobles caught half-dressed in stables, knights who rode home so tipsy they forgot their titles at the door. These stories spread fast, traveling the roads, with the minstrels who sang them tangled in the roots of 1,000 villages, like a vine that refused to die. Picture a circle of villagers pressed close around the hearth mugs in hand faces flushed with warmth and the sharp tang of weak ale. The minstrel strums a lazy chord eyes, flicking around the room to weigh the mood. A new rumor slips from his lips, a lord's daughter caught brewing her own spiced mead behind monastery walls. Is it true? Or just enough of a tale to earn him another mug? No one knows. No one cares. Laughter echoes anyway. Some landlords loved these traveling bards' free entertainment to keep drinkers spending pennies until the barrels scraped dry. Others watched them like hawks wary of loose tongues and songs that might stir up trouble. A clever bard balanced both charm the alewife for a hot meal, flatter the landlord for a roof slip, whispers to the field hands that the next village over had weaker ale and fewer stories worth hearing. Minstrels didn't just haunt the taverns. Sometimes they drifted through mead halls, swapping heroic oaths for spiced cider or honey wine thick enough to stick to your teeth. Or they trailed behind harvest fairs and market days, gathering gossip like wild herbs for the next village's tale. One day, they'd sing praises of a local brewer's magical mash. The next, they'd hint it was watered down with river sludge when the ale taster looked away. Step into a smoky corner mug in hand as tonight's bard launches into a tale so outrageous it has the stable boy wheezing with laughter and the blacksmith pounding the table in disbelief. The story spills from his lips, a night so deep in his cups, he wagered his horse for a barrel of monastery ale and lost both when he fell asleep in a pigsty. The crowd roars. A coin clinks at the bard's feet. Another mug slides into his waiting palm. Some scraps of parchment hint that minstrels were more than mere gossip peddlers. A few doubled as messengers slipping news true or twisted between villages where written word rarely traveled faster than a donkey's pace. A clever lord might pay a minstrel to spread a rumor that bent a rival's reputation just enough to tilt a tax or sway a marriage bargain. Researchers continue to debate just how much politics these muddy-booted singers stirred up between verses and sips of free ale. Of course, the truth of a rumor never really mattered after the fourth mug. Once the singing started and the barrels gurgled low, neighbors leaned close to swap their own stories, some older than the village itself, others born that very night in the gaps between truth and fermented nonsense. The minstrel's grin flashes in the rushlight glow, as he tunes his lute for one last round. Outside dawn is a rumor still hidden by thick timber shutters, but inside, the tavern floor hums with spilled drink and half-remembered tales. When the final chord fades and the last mug is drained, the bard will drift on boots, scuffing muddy lanes toward the next village. Pockets, lighthead, heavy with fresh gossip, versus brewing like ale in a hidden barrel. So, tilt your cup once more. Feel the warmth swirl against the chill, creeping through the thatch above. And remember that somewhere on a winding road, a ragged bard hums a song that might make you a hero or a fool by next winter, depending on who's pouring the next mug. Wake with the soft ache of yesterday's laughter and the sour tang of half-remembered ale still on your tongue. Push open the creaking cottage door and follow the drifting sound of fiddles and laughter down a muddy lane to the heart of the village green. Once or twice a year, if the harvest was kind and winter hadn't bitten too hard, the peasants let the barrels flow freely under open skies at the seasonal booze fair. Picture rough wooden stalls dressed in scraps of cloth and faded flags, casks stacked high behind hay bales, and the hum of a crowd that mixes livestock, bleats with the rising cheer of mugs clinking in every hand. If the tavern was your hearth and the mead hall your pledge house, the booze fair was your brief escape, a fleeting holiday where the world turned upside down just for a day or two on a tide of cider ale and mead. These fairs were no royal courts, no velvet gowns, no jeweled goblets. Here peasants sold what they brewed at home, barrels of small beer jugs, of sour cider, bottles of thick sweet mead, if the bees had blessed them that summer. Payment was coin when you had it, trade when you didn't. Eggs for a mug, a mended tunic for a jug, a bushel of late apples for whatever the alewife could spare. At dawn, the air is already thick, with the smell of roasting meat, spilled cider seeping into straw underfoot. A fiddler strikes up a tune beside a row of barrels, while children sneak sips when mothers aren't looking. Young lovers slip behind stalls to share kisses and stolen gulps of last season's sharpest brew. By noon, the fair swells into a tide of music, barter and drink, strong enough to drown the memory of lean winters and bad harvests, if only for a day. Surviving town rolls hint at how village elders worried over these fairs. Too much drink, they feared, led to too many quarrels. One parish scroll from a Devonshire hamlet notes fines for riotous mischief at the midsummer ale fair, brawls over watered cider, shouting matches that ended in overturned barrels, and a mud-soaked crowd roaring for more. Scholars still debate whether these outbursts were as wild as the records claim, or simply excuses for local bailiffs to skim a fine from the fun. Imagine standing by a row of stalls, mug in hand, watching the crowd swirl around you, farmers trading gossip about next season's barley yield alewives, comparing herbs and secrets for the next batch, a monk haggling for a barrel of mead to slip back behind monastery gates before the abbot asks too many questions. In the far corner of the fair, a makeshift ring draws cheers as two brawny lads wrestle for a jug of cider, slipping in the mud while elders shout wagers between sips. Nearby, an old woman cackles as she pours her nettle ale into cracked clay cups, bragging hers will keep the drinker warm through the worst winter night. Whether that's true or a trick to sell the last drop before dusk, no one cares enough to question drink first, worry later. As dusk settles, lanterns flicker to life above the stalls, firelight dancing on barrels drained halfway down. A bard perched on an overturned keg hums a lazy tune about a farmer who pledged his best pig for a jug of honey wine and woke up to find the pig gone, the jug empty, and his wife laughing at the bargain. The fair roars at the punchline mugs slosh, and somewhere behind a stall, someone snores softly into the straw festival, fatigued nothing more. Step back for a moment and look around. This gathering is more than drunken revelry. For a day, debts soften under the balm of shared drink. The poorest cottager might stand shoulder to shoulder with the wealthiest farmer mugs raise the same gossip swirling like wood smoke. Promises are made here, some kept, some forgotten by dawn. But for now, they bind neighbors together in a brief unity sweeter than the strongest mead. Researchers continue to puzzle over the true impact of these fairs. Some see them as dangerous pressure valves, where the strain of taxes, bad harvests, and local feuds bubbled over in drunken brawls. Others argue they were vital short bright spells when peasants could trade flirt boast and barter for the winter ahead while the barrels ran dry, and laughter kept the shadows at bay. As the fair winds down and the music fades, children sleep on benches beside snoring elders, and the last mugs are drained over whispered plans for next year's brew. Tomorrow, the stalls will be pulled down the barrels, carted home on creaking wagons, the gossip drift into everyday chores. But tonight, under the soft wash of moonlight, a single truth lingers in the damp air. The fair was not just about the ale. It was a promise that come what may, neighbors would stand side by side for another year, cups ready to lift again. So let your mug rest empty in your palm. Feel the last warmth seep from clay to skin as the final fiddle tune drifts off into the night. And know that for the medieval peasant, a seasonal booze fair was never just about what they drank. It was about who they drank it with, and the thin, sweet thread of community that wound through every barrel, every muddy lane, and every laughter-soaked promise made under stars. Dawn creeps over the fairground, now quiet, but for the soft groans of sleepers and the rustle of straw under boots. Somewhere nearby, a mug rolls across the packed earth, spilling the last drops of stale cider into a puddle where a stray goose pecks for crumbs. But if you think all this medieval boozing ended with sleepy fairgoers and gentle snores, think again. There was a darker undercurrent to all this merriment, one that filled town rolls and court parchments with tales of drunken brawls, stolen barrels, and punishments stranger than fiction. Step into the village stocks, your ankles pinched by rough wood, your head pounding from last night's ale. The sun rises, villagers drift past, and your crime is no grand theft or bloody feud. Know your sin is simple public drunkenness, a catch-all charge for peasants who let one mug too many tip them into a brawl, a fence-breaking spree, or the simple disgrace of sleeping it off in the wrong field. Court records from Yorkshire to Kent still whisper these tales. A laborer who lifted a neighbor's half-full barrel and staggered off into the night. A tavern scuffle over who owed what for a round of cider. A farmer caught knocking down a rival's fence after too much small beer at the midsummer fair. Some scholars remain puzzled by the sheer creativity of punishments for these petty ale crimes. Stocks in the village square were the mildest humiliation, nothing more than a few hours exposed to gossip jeers and maybe a rotten turnip flung by a neighbor with a grudge. More stubborn drunks earned time in the pillory wrists, pinned neck, pressed tight, forced to stand, while townsfolk laughed, scolded, or made pointed jokes about whose ale turned their brains to mush. Imagine the gossip swirling around you as you stand locked in place, a sour hangover settling in your bones, while the local alewife passes by with a wink. She knows tomorrow you'll be back at her door coins, clinking, reputation bruised, but thirst unchanged. One village's parchment tells of a man fined for loud bellowing in the lanes after dark, a polite way to say he sang old tavern songs at the top of his lungs until the constable dragged him off to sober up under lock and key. Yet not every drunken crime ended in the stocks. More serious offenses like stealing ale barrels or shorting a neighbor's jug with swamp water could land a peasant in front of the manorial court, forced to pay a fine that might drain a whole season's spare coins. Some repeat offenders found themselves barred from brewing, altogether a harsh blow, in villages where making or selling ale kept bread on the table when fields failed. Researchers dig through these scraps of local law, noting how punishments often blurred lines between crime and community theater. Stocks and pillories weren't just corrections, they were cautionary tales. Children passing on errands gawked at red-faced drunks, locked up for all to see a lesson to hold your ale or keep your mouth shut when it made your fists loose. But did these humiliations really sober up medieval drinkers? Hardly. The same constables who fined peasants for drunken brawls often turned blind eyes when ale tasters drank more than they tested. Some local lords quietly pocketed fines while ordering fresh barrels for their own kitchens. One fragment from a manorial roll hints at a constable who confiscated an illegal barrel, then tapped it himself at his daughter's wedding the next day. Step back into the tavern on a damp evening, a fire flickering in the hearth, and the same men who stumbled through stocks days ago lean over mugs once more. Laughter bubbles up as someone mimics the public drunk stuck in the square, arms spread wide, voice slurred in mock protest. Gossip flies, bets are made, who'll be next, who'll get away with it, who'll find themselves barefoot in the stocks come next dawn. In these petty punishments, a strange balance hummed beneath the surface. Ale brought warmth, courage, and kinship, but tipped too far, and it cost your pride, your coin, or your brewing rights. The villagers knew the line was thin and crooked, but they crossed it anyway, again and again, generation after generation, because for every brawl or fine, there were 10 nights of quiet mugs lifted to tired lips by flickering firelight, unpunished and mostly forgotten. And so you stand there, ankles pinch the sun, climbing overhead, neighbors drifting past with sacks of barley baskets of eggs, and sly smiles that say they too know the taste of a bad batch, and a night that went one cup too far. Tomorrow, the stocks will stand empty once more, waiting patiently, like an old barrel that never leaks for the next fool who drinks more than he can carry home on muddy feet. So lift your mug in your mind, press it to cracked lips, and sip the lesson learned too late in a medieval village. Ale was mercy and mischief, cure and crime punishment, and prize, sometimes all in the same muddy mug. Step into a dim stone cellar now, where the air is cool and damp, and the barrels line the walls like silent sentinels. You'd think the greatest threat in medieval brewing was a nosy ale taster or a neighbor's wagging tongue. But sometimes the real danger hissed and popped from within the barrels themselves. For all their humble look, these wooden casks could burst spill and even spark fires fierce enough to level half a village if fortune frowned. Picture a peasant's cottage after harvest sacks of grain stacked by the hearth, a copper pot bubbling on the low fire, the air thick with the yeasty tang of fermenting mash. Outside, frost creeps across the fields, but inside the casks bubble with quiet promise liquid warmth for the long winter. Yet lurking under that promise was a threat few peasants fully understood. Pressure built as yeast, feasted on sugars trapped beneath rough wooden staves sealed with pitch or wax. One weak seam and crack, the barrel split wide, spewing sticky foam across dirt floors, soaking precious grain sacks that took weeks to gather. Some scholars argue that medieval brewing mishaps were as common as spilled milk at the morning meal. One record from a Flemish village tells of a family who lost half a winter's drink when a barrel simply popped in the night. Another tale more tragic than funny hints at a cellar explosion so fierce it splintered beams and set a kitchen fire that burned 3 cottages to the ground before the neighbors could form a bucket line. Step into that cellar with me now. The flicker of a single tallow candle dances on curved barrel tops. You press your palm to one cask warm to the touch, trembling ever so slightly. Some villagers swore they could hear the yeast at work, a gentle hiss that promised good drink if only the wood held fast. The brave among them tapped the barrel's daily easing pressure with a careful hammer and wedge. The careless trusted luck, and luck did not always oblige. Above ground tavern, keepers feared the same risk on a larger scale. Bigger barrels, more drink, more chance for a miscalculation. In a busy village inn, a single cracked stave might ruin a week's trade, or spark rumors that a landlord watered his ale to hide a spoiled batch. Some innkeepers turned to cellars dug deep under stone floors where the cool air slowed fermentation. But not everyone could afford stone walls and proper drainage. For many peasants, barrels simply sat in the warm corner of a cramped cottage, a ticking cask that might fizz away safely or blow apart without warning. When barrels failed, gossip spread like spilled ale. A family who lost a batch might suffer hungry weeks until spring barley rose again. A tavern that served stale, half-fermented swill, after a mishap, might find its benches empty for months. And for those who sold their excess at seasonal fairs, a burst barrel was more than an inconvenience. It was lost coin, lost barter, lost favor in the dance of neighborly trade. Monasteries with their cellars built like small fortresses fared better. Brothers tended their barrels with monastic diligence, tapping casks by torchlight, whispering prayers that the wood would hold. Some abbeys even employed barrel makers, coopers, who earned small fame for building staves so tight they might hold a monk's secret sins as well as his strongest ale. Researchers still debate whether these coopers' methods were truly more advanced or simply a bit more careful than a peasant's patchwork repair with twine and hope. One village legend lingers in court scrolls, an entire hamlet forced to rebuild twice in a single decade after boozy blazes. A barn stacked with barrels went up in flames one winter night, sparked by a candle knocked over by a half-drunk watchman. Some swear the ale itself fed the flames hissing and roaring as if the barrels were alive and angry at their sudden freedom. And yet, for all the tales of casks turned traitor peasants carried on brewing year after year, the risk was just part of life, like leaky roofs and hungry mice. Better to risk a burst barrel than trust the village well alone. So, they learned patch your staves with care store barrels where the draft can cool the mash, tap them gently when the hiss grows too loud. Listen for the telltale creak of stressed wood. Pray the flame you hold to your mug never finds spilled ale on the floor. Step back into that flickering cellar one last time. The candle sputters, low shadows curl along cold stone, and somewhere in the dark, a barrel lets out a soft sigh as gas escapes through a hairline crack. Maybe it holds another week. Maybe it bursts at dawn. But tonight, at least the cask remains loyal, guarding its sour treasure against thirst, famine, and fire alike. So when you sip your next well-behaved pint, be it sweet mead, thin ale, or a brewer's stout, remember the quiet gamble hidden in every muddy medieval barrel. Each hiss, each creak, each damp cellar floor was a reminder even the humblest drink born from scraps and patience could surprise you sometimes with warmth, sometimes with ruin, but always with a story worth telling beside the hearth when winter winds howled through timber walls. Step away from bursting barrels and smoky taverns. Now follow the winding path up a muddy hill, past hedgerows and mossy stone walls, until you stand at the gates of a place few peasants ever dared to enter, the manor house or castle cold and imposing its high windows, catching candlelight that flickers like distant stars. Here, the drink of choice came not from muddy village barrels, but from distant vineyards' casks, shipped across kingdoms for noble lips alone. Inside the hall hums with softer voices the scrape of knives on trenchers, and the faint clink of goblets, more delicate than any clay mug a peasant might cradle at the hearth. Imported wines were a luxury that marked the line between those who tilled the fields and those who owned them. French claret Spanish sacked the prized Rhine wines. These trickled into noble cellars through tangled roots of trade taxes and bribes that few villagers could imagine, let alone afford. Historians still argue just how much wine truly flowed through these high stone halls. Some scrolls hint at barrels stacked in cool keeps sipped slowly at feasts and betrothals. Others suggest even the grandest lord might water down his stash when supplies ran thin or guests pressed too deep into his generosity. Surviving household rolls show careful tallies: so many gallons of claret for the winter feast, so many jugs set aside for visiting dignitaries, so many coins paid to trusted merchants who cross seas to bring back more. Picture yourself lingering in the shadows of a great hall. A fire roars in an iron grate tall enough to stand inside, casting flickering light over carved beams and long trestle tables groaning under trenchers piled high with roasted game. At the high table, nobles sip from pewter goblets, the wine's dark stain clinging to their lips as they lean close to whisper secrets too sharp for sober tongues. For the servants who hovered at their elbows, the sight of imported wine was both marvel and torment. Many a kitchen boy or scullery maid might sneak a swallow from a dripping jug before it reached the hall, risking a cuff to the ear, or worse if caught. One fragment of a steward's account lists losses in spilled wine so suspiciously large that some scholars suspect the household staff drank as well as their masters, just not openly. Step back from the fire's glow for a moment and listen. Gossip swirls here as freely as the wine rumors of nobles who demanded entire casks just to show off at weddings of castle lords, whose thirst for foreign vintages drained village coffers faster than any tax collector. One surviving letter hints at a minor baron who paid for his French wine in sheep, leaving his tenants grumbling as flocks vanished down muddy roads toward distant ports. Peasants caught glimpses of this luxury only rarely. Maybe a cask cracked open at a wedding, when the lord allowed his workers a cup of watered claret to celebrate a favored heir's betrothal. Maybe a few drops left behind in a half-empty goblet, stolen by a stable boy sweeping rushes after the feast. More often, the wine was a distant rumor, sweet foreign, unreachable, a symbol of a world so close you could see the high windows, but never touch the table beneath them. And yet, that line between the manor's goblet and the villager's mug could blur in odd moments. A friendly lord might gift a jug of leftover claret to a loyal reeve at harvest's end. A bride sent from castle to cottage with a splash of wine in her dowry proof of her new tie to the household above her. One curious record even tells of village elders invited to sip wine at a lord's hall before agreeing to a new tax sweet drink to soften the blow of fresh coins drained from the muddy fields below. Researchers still debate whether such gifts were genuine kindness or clever control. A single jug of wine could bind a peasant family closer to the estate blur resentments over hard winters and high rents. After all, who would complain too loudly when their lips were stained purple with something they'd never taste again unless they stayed loyal? Picture that final stolen moment, a tired laborer trailing behind the servants, catching a whiff of grapes and foreign warmth drifting down from the high table. Maybe if luck was kind a crumb of leftover roast and a drop of wine sipped quick in the shadows, enough to boast about by the village hearth for years to come. So while muddy barrels fermented stale bread and weeds in smoky kitchens up here behind stone walls, another world swirled in delicate goblets, proof that the same drink could divide neighbors as surely as any fence or tax roll. One cup for warmth and survival, the other for status and show. But in the end, both turned lips loose, loosened secrets, and left more than one noble and peasant alike nursing a headache by dawn's thin light. Step back down the hill, from the castle's stone hush, away from imported claret and whispered secrets, and find your feet on the village lanes once more, where tavern doors swing wide on rusty hinges, and the warm, sour tang of ale drifts out to greet cold noses and tired hands. For all their humble barrels and smoky beams, these taverns were more than a place to drink. They were the heart of local politics. Rumor mills soaked in hops and froth, where conspiracies fermented as easily as the mash behind the bar. Picture a tavern near the village green. Timber walls lean under the weight of centuries, rushes crunch underfoot, and the hearth crackles with logs bought by coins dropped on the bar, one muddy mug at a time. Here taxes on ale were no abstract scribble. In a noble's ledger, they were the pinch that turned a good brew into a quiet rebellion if pushed too far. Some historians argue that medieval ale taxes sparked more village fury than any decree about land or sheep. A penny here, a penny there, stacked onto each barrel, each mug, each batch, brewed in the back corner of a cottage kitchen. Coins that could have fed a hungry child or patched a leaky roof vanished into the Lord's coffers, or worse, into the purse of a tax collector who took his share before trudging off to the next unlucky hamlet. Inside, gossip drifts thick as pipe smoke. Lean closer to the rough oak bar, and you'll hear whispers of conspiracies, tavern keepers suspected of watering down ale to stretch taxed barrels, or secret deals struck behind shutters to brew stronger stuff away from prying eyes. One village's court rolls tell of landlords fined for deceitful measures, short pours that cheated drinkers out of every precious drop. Yet many a customer looked the other way, so long as the gossip stayed juicy and the next round came cheap. Step around the corner to the tavern's shadowy back room, where the fire burns lower and the talk grows sharper. Here farmers press heads together over mugs plotting how to dodge the next tax collector's rounds. An alewife leans in voice low, suggesting a special batch brewed beyond the reach of the Lord's ledgers. Some tales claim entire hamlets banded together. If the taxman squeezed too tight, barrels vanished behind garden walls, home-brewed jugs hidden under beds, sold off the books to neighbors who swore loyalty with each secret sip. One parchment fragment from the Welsh border hints at an entire brewing ring tavern, keepers and alewives conspiring to swap barrels before inspections, watering down the weakest stock for official tastings, while the strong stuff waited in hidden sheds. Some scholars remain puzzled by just how organized these conspiracies truly were. Were they desperate stabs at survival, or just neighborly mischief wrapped in the fog of a drunken night? Imagine the tax collector's boots thudding down the lane, parchment scrolls clutched in ink-stained hands, eyes squinting at the tavern door, like a farmer eyeing a fence in need of mending. Inside, the landlord leans on his bar, wiping foam from battered mugs, practicing the same polite lies he's told for years. "Aye, good sir, the barrels are all accounted for, just as your last visit left them." In the back, a fresh cask sweats under a blanket, invisible on any roll, but worth its weight in whispered promises and silent coin. Of course, not every conspiracy stayed hidden. Court fines show repeat offenders, innkeepers hauled before manorial judges for short measures and unlicensed barrels. One record hints at an entire tavern shuttered after the landlord's barrels were found suspiciously light, yet the mugs never seemed to run dry. Some villagers winked that the best brew never touched the official barrel at all, slipping instead from hidden casks only the loyal knew how to ask for. Step back into the main room, where the fire burns bright and the laughter flows as easily as the ale. Here the soft anchor of community wraps around mugs and whispers alike. A good landlord knows when to keep secrets and when to share them. An alewife knows whose debts can linger until harvest and whose tongue should never taste her best brew again. Trust and betrayal bubble just beneath the froth. So tonight, as you cradle your mug in calloused hands, you drink more than barley and yeast. You drink the proof of quiet defiance, the taste of small freedoms brewed in smoky corners when taxes press too tight. And when the barrels run dry and the taxman's boots fade into the distance, the rumors linger like dregs in the bottom of a mug, sweet or sour, depending on who's telling the tale by the fire's dying light. One last sip, one last glance at the landlord's easy smile, the alewife's knowing nod. They all understand a barrel tax too high birth secrets that ferment stronger than any ale. And so long as mugs clink in smoky taverns and gossip drifts through timber beams, there will always be conspiracies brewed in the shadows, hidden casks, silent coins, and the stubborn hope that no tax can squeeze the last drop of freedom from a peasant's muddy mug. And now wander with me to the last call. When the barrel's empty, the gossip settles to an exhausted hush, and the centuries-long hum of peasant brewing slowly fades under the heavy boot of changing times. Imagine the village green, gone quiet after the seasonal fair packs, up its splintered stalls, the tavern hearth cold, the alewife's paddle hung behind the door for good. The age of backyard brewing kitchen, mash pots and secret barrels hidden behind thatch, was never meant to last forever. But oh, how it clung on, sour and stubborn to the end. Step back to the late medieval twilight, when kings and lords decided that mugs and barrels, once the domain of cottages and smoky hearths, now needed rules, real rules. Taxes tightened like a noose around every bubbling pot. Where once a mother stirred mash beside her bread oven without a second thought, new ordinances crept in official measures. Guild seals paid inspectors who prowled lanes looking for illegal brew. Scholars still debate whether these early brewing laws truly safeguarded public health or simply filled noble coffers faster. One record from Tudor England shows an entire village fined for refusing to join the new brewing guild, its alewives forced to pay a tax just to boil mash in their own kitchens. For peasants already scraping by on muddy harvests and thin barley crops, it was yet another corner of daily life, fenced off for those with coin and power. The old ways didn't vanish overnight. Step inside a late cottage flickering with rushlights and warm with the familiar sour scent of fermenting grain. An old woman dips her spoon into a battered pot, tasting for that hint of fizz that says the yeast is alive. Her daughter whispers that the taxman passed through the next parish only days ago. Tonight's brew will stay hidden under wool blankets in the loft, a secret between family and the wind rattling the shutters. Yet as towns grew, the village's grip on the drink that once kept children alive and fathers steady at the plow began to slip. Large breweries rose behind city walls, bigger barrels bound by iron hoops instead of fraying rope and prayer. Alewives faded into tavern wives, their benches replaced by copper kettles that hiss day and night under guild watch. The home cask, once the village's lifeline, was now a curiosity still bubbling in some smoky corners, but shrinking year by year under the press of taxes and proper production. Imagine a once thriving tavern, dark for good, its benches stacked in dusty piles. No more barefoot children fetching jugs under shawls. No more minstrels coaxing a second mug with a new rumor. What survived were the records town rolls, full of fines, royal decrees scribbled with spidery Latin, a few stray folk songs mumbling about barrels bursting in the night, or an alewife outfoxing an inspector one final time. Researchers continue to puzzle over how peasants mourn this loss, if they mourned at all. Some claim the end of rustic brewing was less a tragedy than a quiet relief for tired mothers who no longer risked fines or sleepless nights minding a tricky mash. Others argue that in the clatter of tavern doors swinging shut and backyard barrels drying out, villages lost something more than drink, a thread of independence, a flicker of local mischief, a reason for neighbors to gather when the fields lay still. But not all secrets die so easily. Step outside one last time. The night air is cold, the cottage roofs slick with mist. Somewhere behind a warped barn door, or beneath a sagging thatch, a single barrel still sighs with yeast at work, a soft bubble of defiance against the new world of measured mugs and taxed foam. And in that small hiss, the muddy ghosts of medieval brewing linger on scraps turned to warmth. Stale bread, reborn in sour dreams, secrets poured by the mugful when no inspector was near to listen. So as you lay back, now drifting toward sleep under your blanket's quiet weight, remember the peasants who turned weeds and scraps into survival, who raised mugs to cold winters and high taxes alike, who brewed courage into thin beer for children and strong drink for whispered oaths. In every drop, a promise that for as long as barrels bubble in hidden corners, the last call never truly comes. And just beyond that quiet barrel, the orchard waits, branches twisted with the same stubbornness secrets, clinging to thorns, and windfall, daring you to taste what's left hidden. You walk among trees that feel half forgotten, twisted branches catching your sleeves, the ground littered with bruised fruit you've never tasted before. These aren't the neat apple rows of modern cider farms. These are medieval patches, small family plots, or shared commons where villagers gambled on what might grow if the frost stayed kind. You stoop to pick up a lumpy, soft orb. This is a meddler of fruit, once prized not for its freshness, but for the way it spoiled. Strange, not to medieval farmers. They knew a meddler had to blet to rot slightly until its inside turned sweet, mushy, and tangy all at once. It's one of history's quirks that something so shriveled was once worthy of a winter feast. Historians still argue whether these orchards were planned luxuries or desperate experiments. Did people cultivate meddlers and sloes out of choice or necessity when finer fruits refused to flourish? Beneath your feet, a damp carpet of fallen fruit whispers stories of harvests nobody counted. Peasants, smallholders, wandering monks, they all plucked what they could. In these same orchards, sloe bushes thick with blue blackberries hid in hedgerows bordering fields like thorny secrets. Some say sloes were the poor man's grape, tiny sour demanding sugar, or honey to be drinkable. But once tamed, they turned into vibrant sloe gin, or rough spiced country wine that warmed more than just the belly. You reach for a low branch and brush against damp leaves. Imagine the rustle of linen sleeves as medieval women and children combed these patches. Autumn was a family affair, baskets balanced on hips, aprons sticky with juice teeth stained purple. They'd gather fruits too sharp to eat raw, waiting until fermentation turned harshness into depth. And while today's supermarkets worship the perfect apple, the villagers cared more about what these odd fruits could become in a barrel. It wasn't all rustic trial and error. Some orchards belonged to monasteries tended by monks who guarded their fruit trees like sacred relics. Their produce was destined for cloistered cellars, sweet and spiced, sometimes blessed, sometimes taxed. Records of Benedictine orchards show lists of quince crabapple and medlar varieties scribbled in neat Latin each one, an ingredient for winter warmth. Some scholars remain puzzled by how these rural patches sustained such a varied harvest in climates that barely tolerated delicate buds. Did they graft? Did they trade slips from traveler to traveler? There's no single answer, just a patchwork of clues. Picture an orchard at dawn. Frost clings to branches, and somewhere nearby, an old wooden press squeaks as the first apples, or medlars, are crushed. A boy carries a bucket to catch the drips, careful not to spill a drop. Somewhere in the hedgerow, a stoat darts out, startled by the crack of a twig. Birds swoop for fallen fruit. It's a small, eternal scene, one that repeats every harvest season, feeding homes and ales alike. Among these crooked trees, secrets fermented slowly. Some fruits never reached the Lord's table, but found their purpose in humble cottages. If a medlar harvest was good, a village might share out the spoils, each household adding a handful to their next brew. Even bitter crab apples found second lives in ciders. And if the harvest failed, villagers turned to the hedgerows gathering wild berries no orchard master could claim. You step carefully around a fallen trunk, brushing aside leaves slick with morning dew. In your hand, a sloe berry rolls between your fingers, hard, sour, defiant. Some peasants called them blackthorns, a nod to the wicked spines guarding the bushes. Picking sloes meant scratched arms, torn sleeves, and brambles that clung like rumors. Yet year after year, they came back for more. Folk songs whispered of girls with sloe black eyes, proof that even this humble fruit left its mark on poetry and charm. From time to time, you'll find tales of orchard keepers who experimented wildly. They'd cross trees, graft branches, slip foreign seeds into local soil. There's a theory that traveling pilgrims brought cuttings from distant lands, bits of Persia, scraps of southern France, tucked in bags or sewn into cloaks. Did they thrive here sometimes? More often, the climate bit back, killing tender shoots with an early frost. But the stubborn ones survived, becoming local legends. Behind every crooked tree, there's a ghost of someone's hope, an orchard keeper with sticky hands, a cider wife pressing fruit at dawn, a monk scribbling yield records by candlelight. Their legacy lingers in hedgerow hedges, in the taste of old-fashioned liqueurs you might stumble on at a rural pub. Some say a few ancient medlar trees still stand in forgotten corners of England and France, gnarled and half hollow, yet flowering bravely each spring. The orchard path twists on brambles, tugging at your sleeves, mist clinging to your boots. You pause to look back at shadows between branches at the scatter of windfalls beneath crooked trunks. These fields were never meant to impress royalty. They were for villagers with calloused hands and patient hearts, people who knew that the best brews came not from sweetness alone, but from time waiting and just enough decay to turn rot into warmth. No one today can say for sure why meddlers fell from favor, or why slows lost their place in everyday brewing. Industrialization, new trade routes, shifting tastes each played its part. Some historians claim the orchard's secrets weren't lost, but simply hidden, waiting for curious wanderers to pick them up again, like you tracing forgotten rows under a drifting moon. So you walk on the orchard behind you, the hush of branches giving way to the wild tangle of hedgerows just ahead. Strange fruits linger in your mouth like a half-remembered dream, sour, sweet, stubborn. And somewhere in that taste is a promise that the next step might reveal another hidden harvest, waiting to be brewed into something warm enough to carry you through the night. A soft rustle at your shoulder reminds you that orchard rows don't mark the end of medieval harvests. Sometimes the best ingredients hide where fields blur into wild country. The hedgerow part, boundary part, pantry, part secret map, for those who knew what to pluck when no orchard keeper was watching. Step closer. You brush your hand along bramble and thorn, tracing the sprawl of green where berries wink in the low dawn light. Here, along these unruly borders, villagers gleaned handfuls of elderberries, rose hips, wild blackberries, tiny treasures that turned humble ales and rustic ciders into something more than just a drink. Some hedgerows stretched for miles, living fences tangled with hawthorn, hazel, and bramble. To the untrained eye, they were scratchy walls to keep sheep in or neighbors out. But for the quiet gatherer, these hedges were a hidden orchard, all their own. You kneel, pick a cluster of berries, feel the stickiness of juice seeping into your fingertips. Medieval villagers knew which berries sweetened first frost, which turned sharp and stubborn if left too long. There was no waste. Every bramble, every thorny tangle, a tiny promise of something fermentable. Children scrambled barefoot along these hedges, with baskets too big for their arms, scratching skin, and snagging clothes returning home with cheeks stained purple. Some elders claimed the best hedge harvests came after harsh winters, when a late frost coaxed extra sugar into the berries. Folk wisdom, or not a hedgerow berry, meant warmth when barley ran thin. Brewmasters sometimes traded with foragers baskets of bilberries or elderberries for a jug of last season's brew. Some say hedgerow beers were rustic and rough, best drunk in company, so no one noticed the sharp bite or the slightly sour aftertaste. Historians still argue whether these rural hedge brews were poor man's substitutes or a quiet rebellion against official ale guilds and church taxes. Records are scarce, like the berries themselves plucked clean before winter could claim them. You imagine the hushed chatter of villagers at dawn, slipping along the hedgerows, with wicker baskets and gossip. A pair of sisters tug at stubborn brambles, cursing thorns, but laughing too loud when they stumble into nettles. A stooped grandfather taps a branch with his walking stick, knocking loose a handful of hawthorn berries he swears make the sharpest cider. Nobody here is rich except in secrets. Hedgerows were more than food. Some doubled as old pagan shrines, places where charms were tied to branches and scraps of cloth fluttered in the breeze. A woman might whisper a wish to the hawthorn for good harvest, or slip a dried berry into her pocket as a charm against winter's hunger. Researchers continue to debate whether these rituals were pure superstition or half-remembered nods to ancient rites softened by the church, yet never fully uprooted. A thorn scratches your knuckle sharp enough to sting not enough to bleed. You lick berry juice from your thumb, tasting sharpness and sweetness tangled together. This mix, sour and sweet, was the heartbeat of hedgerow brewing. Nothing balanced by science, no neat recipes scrawled on parchment, just folk memory, trial and error, and the stubborn hope that nature's fence would always bear enough fruit to fill a jug or two. Imagine a hedge running along a forgotten lane. Frost rims the leaves, but underneath life clings on. A passing monk might pause to gather rose hips for a spiced cordial, pretending not to notice the village children trailing behind him, watching where he plucks. In the distance, a smoke plume hints at cider, boiling over somewhere honey stirred in to mellow the sharpness. A moment later, the hush returns, just wind through thorns, and the tiny sound of berries dropping into a basket. It's easy to think hedgerow brewing was a peasant's last resort, but some lords and ladies found the taste exotic. Manor kitchens sometimes simmered hedge berries into syrups to drizzle over roasted meats. Village fairs poured cups of tart, bright elderberry wine beside richer ales. Some old recipes survived only as scribbled margins in cookbooks. Tiny notations about hedge fruit to the pot, squeezed between grander feasts and royal banquets. Walk further, and the hedgerow thickens, blocking out the orchard behind you. For a moment, you're invisible, just another figure bent over bramble and thorn humming a tune to ward off crows. Medieval folk understood that hedgerows were alive, fox paths, badger dens, birds nesting low in the bramble, a living pantry and a wild sanctuary in the same breath. It's said some hedgerow secrets vanished when big estates enclosed common lands. Fences went up, borders shifted, and what was once a neighborly hedge became private ground. But scraps linger, old footpaths that cut through farmland hedgerows that refuse to die even when the plow bit deep. Some corners of the English countryside still hum with berries stubborn as any ghost. Back then, when the harvest was good, families would gather by lantern light, pressing berries through cloth, adding them to casks of ale or cider left bubbling in cool cellars. There's no scholarly consensus on whether these berry ales were safer than plain water. Some argue they were. Others suspect the wild yeast carried surprises of its own. Either way, the ritual endured hedgerow harvests folded into village life like an untamed promise that nature would always give a little extra if you dared the thorns. You rise from the hedge palms, sticky sleeves, dusted with leaf bits. In your mind, the hedgerow hums a corridor between orchard rows and wild fields, a border that was never quite a wall. You look back once more, imagining voices drifting between the branches, children's laughter, a woman's whispered charm, a brewer's quiet calculations about how many berries might stretch a barrel through one more winter. Here in these tangled hedges, you understand the old countryside. Truth, no fruit was too small to brew, no thorn too sharp to stop a determined hand. What the orchard planned, the hedgerow answered, and between them, medieval villagers found a balance sweeter than any lord's vineyard could promise. With your basket imagined or real, you step from the hedge's embrace, brushing off brambles, blinking as the path opens ahead. The orchard lies behind you now, but its wild cousin, the hedgerow, has left its stain on your fingers and its secrets on your tongue. And the path carries you on deeper into fields and forests, where another secret pouch of flavor waits to be opened. If the hedgerows were nature's open buffet, then the healer's satchel was a private pantry of wilder flavors, still herbs so humble you'd almost miss them underfoot, yet powerful enough to shape the taste of an entire village's brew. Step into the flicker of a cottage fire, where dried bundles dangle from beams, and the air prickles with scents sharp enough to wake even the sleepiest mind. Here you'll find mugwort, its feathery leaves crackling between the herbalist's fingers as she tosses a handful into a simmering pot. Mugwort, they said, could keep bad spirits at bay, stir vivid dreams, or simply lend an earthy bitterness to a rough barley ale. It thrived in hedgerows too, but in the healer's hands, it became more than just a roadside weed. It turned beer into tonic drink, into quiet remedy. Some scholars remain puzzled by how thoroughly these humble plants wove into brewing lore, while official recipes barely whispered their names. Beneath the bundles of mugwort hangs yarrow white-flowered, sharp-scented. Medieval brewers knew its secret yarrow lent not only bitterness, but a mild preservation, a hedge against spoilage in the days before hops rose to fame. And yet the same yarrow appeared in poultices for wounds or in charms against fevers, proof that a single plant could live a double life, medicine by day, brewing companion by night. You stand by the hearth, warmth on your shins, as the healer grinds dried herbs with a pestle. The stone bowl hums under her touch, a rhythmic sound that echoes centuries back to when knowledge passed not in books, but from hands to hands, mouth to ear. Imagine the quiet gossip traded for a pinch of dried mugwort, or a secret blend of wildflowers slipped into ale to coax out sleep. Some say the church frowned on such loose recipes. Brew too strong, dream too vivid, and suspicion might follow. Yet records suggest church alewives and monks alike used mugwort when hops were scarce, proving that piety and pagan root lore often brewed together in the same battered cauldron. Historians still argue whether herbal brewing was survival craft or quiet resistance to guild rules that locked out the poorest crafters. A gust rattles the cottage door, carrying in the scent of damp earth. The healer wraps the pouch tight, ties it with a twist of flax, and hides it away, sometimes under floorboards, sometimes buried near a hedge to keep its secrets fresh. Villagers swore by her blends: mugwort for courage, yarrow for luck, a dash of sweet woodruff for mild sweetness when honey was scarce. Picture an alewife at her door, apron dusted with flour, slipping the healer a coin or a wedge of fresh cheese in exchange for a palmful of dried herb. Later that evening, she'd tip it into the bubbling wort. No measured scoop, just the instinct of years. Some batches turned sharp, some mellow. Some surprised the drinker with a pleasant dream, or so the folk claimed. In those days, brewing wasn't science. It was closer to kitchen magic, half folktale, half necessity. You crouch near the hearth, tracing your fingers through stray leaves fallen from the work table. A soft hum fills the cottage kettle, hissing the crackle of dry stems, the low mutter of a charm spoken half for show, half for memory's sake. For centuries, the herbalist's pouch kept brewing alive in lean times, when barley stores dipped too low, when hops shipments failed, when taxes rose so high the village alehouse squeezed every drop of flavor from weeds and hedgerow greens. Records from old manor accounts hint that not every nobleman looked kindly on such rustic ingenuity. Taxes on ale filled coffers better when hops were used, regulated weighed recorded. Wild herbs, harder to tax, harder to trace. Some local lords turned blind eyes so long as the village tithes arrived on time. Others cracked down, seizing herbalist bundles and burning them alongside other questionable practices. Yet the practice slipped through gaps like roots through stone walls. Quiet, persistent, always ready to sprout when fields ran thin. Step back from the hearth. Glance at the bundles swaying above shadow shapes dancing like bottled ghosts in the smoke. Each leaf carries more than flavor. It carries stories whispered over low fires, secrets tucked into recipe scraps, small rebellions brewed into barrels too humble to ever cross a castle gate. And if you taste a mugwort ale today, rare reimagined by experimental craft brewers, you sip centuries of hedgerow wisdom disguised as a drink. You wipe dust from your palms, nod to the healer, and step back through the cottage door. The night air tastes of damp bark and wild herbs, a reminder that the next brew waits not in the orchard or hedgerow alone, but in the careful hands of someone who knows how to coax warmth from weeds. Beyond the cottage, the path winds deeper, leading you past village thresholds, where barrels bubble by the hearth, waiting for the next pinch of leaf, the next whispered secret. Ahead lies a taste test of opposite sweet and sour honey and sharp apple, the odd harmony that made medieval brewing more an experiment than a rule. And with each step, the flavors tangle on your tongue, tugging you forward into the next sip of the past. You pause at the bend in the path, where the tang of herbs fades and the crisp scent of apples drifts in sweet and sour dancing together on the breeze. If orchard fruits and hedgerow berries were nature's free gifts, then the real alchemy of medieval brewing happened in the quiet tug-of-war between sharpness and sugar. Taste, after all, was more than pleasure. It was survival disguise, and sometimes an accidental masterpiece. Step inside a timber-beamed brew house, the air warm with steam rising from open vats. You stand near a wide tub where someone stirs a mash of pulped apples, wild herbs, and a swirl of honey. This isn't your crisp supermarket cider. This is medieval, must half fermented, half mystery, a bubbling experiment to see how sour can become smooth and rough can become rich. Villagers prize sharp apples, crab apples that puckered the tongue, small wild pears that bit back when eaten raw. They crushed them, strained them, sweetened them with honey, or leftover comb scrapings from secret mead hives. Nothing wasted. The aim wasn't just to brew something drinkable, it was to trick the tongue into comfort when grain ran thin or when water was best avoided. Some families kept a few hives tucked behind orchard walls or in hollow logs near hedgerows. Wild bees worked unnoticed, spinning sweetness the brewer could tap when needed. A drop of honey to round out a rough batch, a spoonful to lift the taste just enough to please a skeptical neighbor. Historians still argue whether medieval palates leaned sour because they liked it or because sweeteners were precious. After all, sugar from distant lands cost a fortune. Honey local, hidden fiercely guarded, was the peasant's secret sweetness, a way to soften bitter sips when guests came calling. You watch a brewer's apprentice test the brew. He dips, a thumb, licks it, squints. Too sharp. He drops in another twist of wildflower, honey stirring slowly as steam coils around his wrist. Some say these early taste experiments were trial and error masterpieces. Others claim they were mostly error, half luck, and half blind faith in what the next barrel might become if left to bubble long enough in a cool cellar. Picture a winter night, a family huddled around the hearth, tankards warm in their hands. The drink inside tastes like orchard frost, mellowed by a single spoon of sweetness, a promise that summer's sun still lingers somewhere in the dark. This wasn't fine wine or noble ale. It was a small miracle crafted by people who understood the fragile line between sharp and soft. Some brewers leaned on herbs when honey ran out, sweet woodruff, or meadow sweet dried flowers that brought gentle sugar to the tongue and sometimes lulled drinkers to early sleep. There's no scholarly consensus on whether these blends were safer or more dangerous. Meadow, sweet in particular, carried myths of pain relief and mild enchantment. Brew too much, sip too deep, and your dreams might drift further than expected. A soft laugh echoes from the corner, someone tipping another ladle into the vat, daring the brew to change once more. Medieval brewers didn't fret over exact measurements or sterile tools. They relied on memory taste buds and whispered tricks passed down through families. If a batch turned too sour, they might add fresh apple, mussed unfermented juice pressed straight from orchard fruit to sweeten the edge. If it turned too cloying, they'd slip in bitter herbs or tart berries from the hedgerow. Balance was a dance, not a science, and every tankard carried the ghost of its adjustments. In the flicker of the brew house, you see barrels marked with rough symbols, an apple scratched on one lid, a bee on another, a single leaf for herb ale. Illiteracy wasn't an obstacle. Taste was the true language here. Each family, each village, each tavern had its secrets, a certain orchard row that bore the sharpest crab apples, a hedge that dripped with late elderberries, a cousin who kept bees behind the vicar's fence. It's easy to imagine these early taste experiments as failures, sour sips spat into the fire barrels tipped to the pigs when the balance slipped beyond saving. Yet the stubbornness of these brewers built traditions that linger still. Craft ciders, sour beers, lambics. They all carry the DNA of villagers who ask themselves, how can we tame sharpness into warmth, bitterness into sweetness? You step closer to the vat, feel the heat of bubbling must rise to your cheeks. Some brewers leaned into the sour bite, claiming it warded off spoilage better than sweetness alone. Others chased the sweetness for feasts and village fairs, places where a sweet brew marked celebration, a break from hardship. The taste was the message. This drink is safe. This moment is warm. This gathering will outlast the cold. A wooden spoon clatters against the rim of the vat. Another taste test, another decision. Somewhere outside the orchard sleeps hedgerows, hum under frost and bees, dream of spring blossoms yet to come. But in this small, smoky room, the balance hangs on a single ladle of honey, a pinch of dried flowers, or the bite of a sharp apple must. Some scholars remain puzzled by how such rustic recipes survive centuries of changing tastes. Yet here you stand, proof that old flavors never die. They just hide until someone dares to sip again. You step back, wiping your palms on your sleeves, the scent of sour fruit and wild honey clinging to your hair. The brew bubbles on, alive and uncertain, a memory of orchard rows and hedgerow trails folded into each swirl of steam. Ahead, spiced secrets wait, flavors from far-off lands that slipped into these barrels when trade routes stretched just far enough to carry cinnamon, ginger, and spices that turned simple ale into an exotic sip. Taste lingers on your tongue, sweet and sharp, and somewhere deep inside you know the next sip might be stranger. Still warmth wrapped in spice, a flavor that carried not just sweetness, but a hint of faraway wonders brewed into a humble village barrel. A single breath of steam, and you're carried from orchard sweetness and sour hedgerow tang straight into the hum of foreign markets, barrels open, spices trickling in like whispers from distant coasts. Step from the village brew house into the flickering world of medieval spice roots, where an ordinary ale could suddenly hum with warmth from places most drinkers would never see. Lean closer to a battered table where sacks of cinnamon sticks rest alongside ginger roots. still crusted with bits of soil. Here, a merchant might pour grains of paradise, tiny seeds flickering with peppery heat into a brewer's cupped hands. This exchange didn't happen in fancy halls, but in back alleys, monastery courtyards, bustling ports, where language slipped between traders like water through cupped palms. Picture a brewer's apprentice sniffing a foreign spice, for the first time eyes wide, unsure if this heat belongs in a barrel of humble ale. Yet, curiosity wins. A pinch here, a scrap there, and the next batch warms the tongue in ways no orchard fruit ever could. Some tavern goers flinched at the bite. Others lined up for more bragging they'd tasted a brew, flavored with the East's secrets. Historians still argue whether these spiced ales were for the elite alone, or if trickles of trade slipped into village mugs more often than the record keepers noted. Surviving accounts hint at both monastery brew books scribble cinnamon beside local herbs. Tavern tallies include ginger or cloves for winter batches meant to chase away chills, and maybe a few spirits too. The taste of spiced ale wasn't just new, it was status poured into a mug. A lord might order casks steeped with rare spices for a wedding feast, each sip proof of coin and connections reaching far beyond the hedgerows and orchards you left behind. For villagers, a spiced brew was a tale in a tankard, a glimpse of worlds bigger than the next field or the forest's edge. Somewhere near the hearth, a brewer measures a sliver of cinnamon into the bubbling vat. The smell lifts instantly warm, sharp, almost sweet, twisting through the sharper notes of barley and wild herbs. You lean in, feel the steam kiss your face, and imagine a time when this scent meant news had arrived. A trader back from Venice, a monk returning from pilgrimage, a barrel stowed on a ship that didn't sink. A sip of spiced ale could carry a drinker somewhere else, if only for a moment. The ginger might tickle the back of your throat. The grains of paradise deliver a peppery surprise that chased away dull winter gloom. Some say it worked better than weak medieval wine spices, masking rough flavors, wild yeast, or the taste of water that sometimes turned questionable at best. Researchers continue to debate whether these spice blends were carefully guarded guild secrets or chaotic experiments, each batch tasting slightly different depending on whose hands held the purse for that shipment. You run your fingers along the edge of a rough wooden cask, feeling the branded mark of a brewing guild proof that behind every spiced sip lay a network of middlemen customs fees and trade tariffs. These weren't your hedgerow berries or orchard cast-offs. Every grain of cinnamon or ginger was weighed, taxed, and spoken of in hushed envy by neighbors who could never spare coin for such extravagance. Yet some spice found its way into village mugs all the same. Perhaps a tavern keeper cut a deal with a traveling merchant. Maybe a pilgrim carried a hidden pouch back from a holy city. Maybe a small barrel half legal slipped off a ship at a foggy port and found its way up muddy tracks to the inn at the edge of town. The taste lingered long after the cask ran dry, a spark of warmth in the memory of cold nights. In the corner of the brew house, a small ledger lies open, ink blots on rough parchment, listing cinnamon zengibir ginger and grains paradisi. The handwriting is cramped, the numbers uneven proof that spices moved not just in king's chests, but in humble brew houses where the margin for error was small and the hunger for novelty endless. Some guild scribes guarded these notes fiercely, brewing secrets worth more than gold in seasons when trade routes tightened and spices doubled in price overnight. A boy sneaks a fingertip of cinnamon from the table, licks it, flinches at the bite. He grins anyway, proof that spice was not just for lords and feasts, but for anyone curious enough to risk a pinch. In his grin lives the whole crooked truth. Spiced ale wasn't just drink, it was an adventure steeped in foreign winds, gossip, and the promise that tomorrow's batch might taste just a little bolder than today's. You breathe in one more swirl of steam, apple sweetness still clinging under the new sharp warmth of spice. The path ahead curls back toward sweetness. Soon enough, bees hum behind hidden hives, and somewhere beyond the next hedgerow waits the golden promise of mead. For now, you carry the taste of spiced ale on your tongue like a question. How did so many distant flavors find their way into humble mugs so far from the docks? The answer flickers in the shadows. Monks with trading partners, merchants with secrets, villagers who slipped a pinch into the barrel and said nothing more. There's no single story here, only steam spice and the endless gamble that a sip of something strange could make a hard winter softer. And so, you step from the brew house's glow out into the cool dark, your mind humming with warmth, as a hidden hive hums nearby, waiting to sweeten the next secret brew under a cloak of buzzing wings and drifting blossoms. Step into the hush of a meadow at dusk, where the last glow of sun catches flickers of wings darting between wildflowers and hollow logs. Listen closer, and you'll hear it, a soft hum, a secret chorus of honeymakers hidden in plain sight. For medieval villagers, bees were more than gentle neighbors. They were the quiet architects of sweetness when sugar caravans failed to reach the village gates. Follow the narrow path behind a crooked cottage, or slip past the hedgerow you left behind. There, tucked beneath a thicket or cradled in the hollow of an old oak, lives a hidden hive. Not every peasant could keep bees openly. Taxes, land rights, and watchful lords made secrecy a kind of survival. So wild beekeepers thrived on the edges, tending half-tamed colonies in glades and forest fringes. Imagine kneeling at dawn, smoke drifting from a clay pot, to calm the swarm as you pry open a rough wooden skep. Honeycomb gleams like amber in the half-light, sticky, fragrant precious. A single hive might sweeten a family's bread, soothe a cough, and most treasured of all, transform a rough brew into something worth toasting when the harvest finally came in. Some scholars remain puzzled by just how widespread these hidden hives really were. Records rarely tell the full tale of secrets kept behind brambles and cottage walls. Inside the hive, life hums with purpose. Medieval folk understood enough to honor it, but not enough to master it completely. A beekeeper's craft passed through families, like an heirloom methods, whispered skep shapes, borrowed from neighbors' tricks for tempting a swarm into a hollow log when the old queen flew off. Sometimes these wild hives were never truly owned, just borrowed from the woods when honey was needed most. Step into a village tavern on the night of a small festival. Candles gutter low as tankards pass from hand to hand, each brim tasting faintly of meadow blossoms and the smoky hint of beeswax. This is mead, honey wine, sometimes thick and golden, sometimes sharp and light, depending on whose hive and which herbs slipped into the vat. Historians still debate whether mead was more common than ale in everyday medieval life. Some argue it was luxury, others that every village had at least one keeper with a hidden stash to sweeten an otherwise hard season. At the tavern, hearth two elders argue over who first taught the village to tempt wild bees into hollow logs. A boy leans close, sticky-fingered, from comb scraps, traded for a pocketful of berries. In the rafters, bunches of dried mugwort hang in tribute to the herbalists, whose secrets sometimes mingled with the beekeeper's trade. To keep a hive hidden was an art sign scratched on trees to mark safe routes, secret paths cleared just wide enough to slip a basket through. Some folks swore bees chose their keepers as much as the other way around, drifting from orchard to forest hedge to hedge, carrying whispers of sweetness to whoever dared to follow. You kneel near the hollow log, watch tiny bodies drift in and out, each bearing a speck of pollen that might sweeten a winter's brew. It wasn't just ale and cider that sipped at this sweetness. Fruit wines, too, relied on a dash of honey when pears or cherries turned too sharp. For those who couldn't afford grapes, honey lifted every sip closer to the feasts of kings, even if only for a single evening. Some local lords taxed honey heavily, counting hives along with pigs and chickens. But a hidden hive was hard to tally, harder still to confiscate. So the wild beekeeper wink-handed over a smaller pot when the reeve came collecting and tucked the best comb deep into the cottage eaves for when the village gathered to share stories and sip warm mead through the coldest nights. The sweetness came with risk, bee stings, theft, spoilage, but each sticky harvest was worth it. Imagine the pride in passing a brimming mug across a wooden table, the warmth of a drink flavored not by coin from distant ports, but by the quiet hum of wings just beyond the orchard fence. A taste of the meadow of wildflowers pressed into liquid gold by creatures no bigger than your fingertip. Not every brew was perfect. Fermenting honey took patience, and luck. Wild yeast might turn a barrel sharp, or a hidden hive might be found and raided by a neighbor desperate to sweeten their own cask. There's no scholarly consensus on whether these meads tasted anything like modern versions. Some accounts praise them as liquid silk. Others describe rough, sharp drinks that needed more herbs to mask their flaws. But to villagers who worked orchards and hedgerows by day, each sip was proof that sweetness could survive hidden and humming, even when taxes, frost, or famine pressed close. Step back from the hive's hush and listen. The meadow hums on bees, tracing invisible roots between blossoms and brambles. In this small miracle, medieval villagers found a promise that even when the orchard failed or the hedgerow froze over, the wild hive might still offer a drop of warmth to stir into the next barrel. So you walk from the hidden hive fingers, sticky with ghosted sweetness mind, drifting to the families who toasted weddings, births, or harvest's end with cups of secret mead. Somewhere ahead, fruit wines wait: pear, cherry, elderberry. Each bottle another testament to the stubborn art of coaxing flavor from whatever nature gave and whatever sweetness the bees left behind. Slip down a winding village lane and follow the faint scent of crushed fruit, there in a shadowed corner behind cottage doors. Families test their luck with wines made not from noble grapes, but from what the orchard, hedgerow, or chance could spare. These are the forgotten fruit wines: pear and cherry, elderberry, and plum-bottled warmth for households that never saw a vineyard yet dreamed of something richer than plain ale. Step inside a low-ceilinged kitchen where a battered barrel stands half hidden behind sacks of grain. A mother checks the cork nose, wrinkling at the sweet, sour tang that leaks from the seams. She nods. Good enough. Not perfect, never perfect, but better than nothing when a winter feast needs a little lift. Historians still argue whether these rough wines ever rivaled grape vintages from warmer lands, or whether they were simply the poor folks' stubborn stand-in, an echo of vineyards they'd never visit. You sit at a rough-hewn table, where a jug passes from hand to hand, each cup poured with more hope than ceremony. A sip of pear wine hums with orchard frost, sharp on the first taste, then mellowing to something soft that sits warm in the chest. It's not the velvet grape blends of distant monks or southern traders. This is local stubborn cloudy in the glass, yet honest on the tongue. Sometimes fruit wines began as small experiments, too many pears bruised in the pressed cherries, gone soft, before the pie elderberries that stained fingers faster than they filled baskets. No waste allowed. A cask tucked in a corner, a handful of wild yeast coaxed from old barrels, and days or weeks later, a surprise for the village table. Some say these accidental wines tasted better than their fancy cousins, fresher, wilder, full of hedgerow mischief. Surviving notes scribbled on recipe scraps suggest mothers guarded these blends like secrets passed from grandmother to granddaughter, far from prying tax collectors or guild inspectors. Picture a harvest feast where no grape wine could be spared, yet mugs of elderberry pour deep and bright. A boy lifts his cup, purple juice staining his lips as fiddles squeak out tunes no scribe bothered to write down. Here fruit wine meant celebration proof that rough times didn't always taste of water and barley alone. Outside under a harvest moon, barrels rest behind stone cottages. A neighbor slips over with a clay jug, swapping stories for a refill. Elderberry wine glints near black in the lantern light, thicker than cherry, sharper than pear. Some villagers claimed it carried a hidden strength, a warming bite, that made a long winter shorter and the path home feel less cold. In monastic records, pear and cherry wines appear now and then, scribbled notes hinting at small orchard plots within cloister walls, where monks pressed fruit when grapes failed to thrive in chillier corners of Europe. Some scholars remain puzzled by how far this knowledge traveled. Was it trade pilgrimage or peasant stubbornness that kept these orchard wines alive century after century? The answer slips between footnotes like spilled juice across a dusty cellar floor. Step back inside the cottage where the barrel rests. Imagine the quiet patience it demanded: no fancy tools, no chemist's scale, just a nose for when the bubbling settled, a tongue for when the sharpness dulled enough to pour. In these small rooms, each bottle hid the story of a hedge or tree or lone orchard row that gave more than it should have, just long enough to fill a cup. Some elderberry wines turned sharp as vinegar if left too long. Pear wine might spoil if autumn rains came early, and the fruit bruised faster than hands could press it. Yet families tried anyway. Always a new batch, always a new barrel, tucked into the corner, behind a sack of oats or a stack of drying herbs. You sip again, imagining the villagers who waited for the first taste. A daughter slipping a mug to her father by the fire, a wife raising a cup to celebrate a harvest saved from ruin by one stubborn tree. Even the lowliest orchard, it seems, could become a vineyard when the need arose. No noble vines on rolling hills, no sprawling estates, just orchard ghosts, pressed into bottles, sweetened by patience and the hush of fermenting fruit in the cool shadows of cottage walls. Outside, an autumn wind rattles the shutters. You hear the faint splash of liquid in a jug, the creak of barrels shifting as the house settles for the night. In some corners of Europe, a few old orchard wines survive still rustic recipes, revived by curious brewers hunting for forgotten flavors. Some claim the taste is closer to the truth than any polished vintage rough sharp, yet oddly comforting, like biting into the memory of an orchard that once fed whole villages through thin years. You stand brushing crumbs from your sleeve, the last sip warming your chest. Beyond the door, a cider mill waits, where apples crunch under wooden beams, and neighbors gather to press harvest into barrels more predictable than wild fruit wine, but never quite as daring. The taste of pear and cherry lingers on your tongue, a fleeting reminder that sometimes the poorest harvest can become the sweetest toast when hands hope and time do their quiet work in the dark. Step through the squeaky cottage door and follow the faint clatter of wooden carts rolling over rutted tracks. Just ahead, you'll hear the rhythmic crunch that marks the heart of a village cider mill in full swing. The orchard gave its fruit, the hedgerow, its berries, the healer, her herbs, but when it came to pure, honest drink, that nearly every soul could claim it was the apple that carried whole villages through dark seasons. Pause by the heavy door of the mill, warm air puffing out into the crisp dusk. Inside, you find neighbors, side-by-side sleeves, rolled boots, sticky with juice laughter, bubbling as fast as the cider trickling from the press. No fancy scrolls here, no secret guild blends, just barrels baskets, and the promise that every apple pressed tonight would ward off hunger's chill come January's frost. Step closer to the great wooden press. It groans as men heave the beam around, grinding baskets of windfalls into sweet pulp. Children dart underfoot, snatching sticky handfuls before the mash disappears under heavy stones. An old woman leans in to catch the first trickle, cloudy sharp full of orchard scent that fills the timbered room like a promise of warmth. Historians still argue whether these communal cider mills were born from practicality or old custom. Some records point to shared feudal plots, others to village charters that demanded every tenant bring their share of apples each autumn. Either way, the mill was more than machinery. It was a gathering, a celebration, and an unspoken contract that no tree's harvest would rot unseen when so many hands could carry it to the press. Listen to the crunch, thousands of apples crushed beneath the beam. You taste the sharpness on your tongue before the cup even reaches your lips, sour from early apples, sweetened by the few late pears slipped in when orchard rows surprised the village with extra yield. Some claim cider tasted best when the fruit was bruised and battered windfall gathered in haste after a storm. Some claim that's folk myth, romantic nonsense for poets. The truth probably lies in the sticky footprints trailing from mill to barrel. At the edge of the press, a boy balances on tiptoes to peek inside the wooden trough. His father tips him a mug foamy with new cider, so sharp it pulls a grimace from his lips. He laughs anyway, proof that even this sour sip beats stale water or thin ale. Researchers continue to debate whether medieval cider was safer to drink than water itself. Records hint at wells fouled by livestock at villages trusting the barrel more than the brook. Beside the main press barrels stand like squat sentinels waiting to be filled. Some cider flows straight in for daily sips. Some ferments longer darkening and strengthening with time. If the harvest is good, a barrel might last a family all winter. If the orchard fails, the mill still runs, pressing crab apples, wild pears, any fruit that might keep the barrel from drying out before spring. Picture the cider mill, at dusk candles, gutter low, children dozing on sacks of straw, neighbors passing a final mug to the miller, who will watch the last trickle seep into the waiting casks. There's no fancy toast, just nods, a grunt of thanks. The quiet promise that next autumn they'll gather here again. Outside, the apple press has its rivals, wild berries, secret herbs, hidden hives, but none compete with its honest abundance. The orchard trees ask for tending the mill for strength and patience, the barrels for time. That's all. The taste that comes of it is both sharp and soft, a sip that hums with orchard sun and the whisper of frost waiting in the hedgerow shadows. Some cider drinkers brag that theirs carries the crisp snap of distant trade spices, or honey slipped in to mellow a batch, or impress a neighbor. Others scoff, swearing by the bite of pure orchard press, unclouded by fancy additions. There is no scholarly consensus on which version reigns supreme. Villagers weren't scribes. They drank what they had compared it by candlelight and let the flavor settle old rivalries as the seasons turned. You wipe your palms on your sleeves as the last beam creaks and settles. The miller's daughter tips a final bucket of mash into the press juice, trickling slow and golden under the moon's rising glow. This is cider, humble, stubborn, a drink born from crooked trees and calloused hands. Some say the best presses happen under threat of frost neighbors racing to squeeze every drop before snow sealed the orchard gates. You step from the mill boots, slick with pulp and sweet must. The air behind you hums with the soft knock of barrels being rolled into cellars' lids, sealed against curious mice and thirsty neighbors. Somewhere up the lane, a cottage door creaks open, ready to warm the next jug by the hearth as songs drift over orchard fences. Past the cider mill, the path leads back to the wild hedges and secret herbs. But tonight, the last taste on your tongue is pure apple sharp, honest and rich, with the laughter of neighbors pressed together like fruit beneath the beam. Push past the cider mill's warm haze and follow the muddy track deeper into the wild edges there hidden under bracken and thorn. You'll find berries that never bowed to orchard rows or neat village presses. Elderberries, bilberries, and other bristly cousins offered a different kind of promise, small, potent, and sometimes more intoxicating than any barley brew poured by guild-approved hands. Step into a clearing where brambles clutch your sleeves and the scent of damp earth clings to your boots. A bent figure hunches over a basket peasant forager, maybe a child sent to slip handfuls of dark berries past the eyes of passing reeves. Elderberries, glossy near black, clustered like tiny secrets never stayed ripe for long. Pluck them too early, and they'd sour your tongue. Leave them too late, and birds would get drunk before the village ever did. Imagine a crooked cottage hearth, where a battered pot bubbles low elderberries simmering with wild yeast swirling unseen in the steam. Some claim these ferments turn sharper than apple cider, headier than ale, an accidental boost for villagers who needed warmth when grain ran short or barley harvests failed. Historians still debate whether these berry brews were harmless peasant folly or quietly subversive drinks that sidestepped brewing guild rules altogether. Lean closer to the pot and catch a waft of sharp, fruity promise. A woman stirs the mash with a birch branch, muttering half to herself, half to the shadows. Elderberry wine was a gamble. Too much wild yeast could sour it fast. Not enough sugar could leave it weak and sour. But when the balance landed just right, one clay cup could turn a silent winter gathering into a hush of sleepy laughter around the hearth. Not every berry brew needed orchard scale or secret hives, just nimble fingers and a willingness to risk scratched arms and purple palms. Bilberries hid deeper than elderberries, forest shadows, heathland brinks, pockets of stubborn scrubland that defied neat plow lines. A good bilberry patch was worth more than a friendly neighbor's orchard row, just enough for one small barrel, just enough for a taste of something wild when the village tavern's ale turned thin. Picture a circle of villagers swapping rumors under the full moon mugs brimming with sharp berry wine lips, stained dark laughter muffled so the landlord's steward wouldn't sniff out a tax unpaid. Some local lords turned a blind eye, Others sent reeves rustling through hedgerows in search of secret fermenting barrels hidden behind cottage walls. Records whisper of fines for unlawful brew, but few accounts reveal how many bramble barrels survived all the same. You duck under a thorny arch and run your palm across a low branch, heavy with dark berries. A blackbird scolds you from above, territorial, annoyed that you might steal its winter feast. Medieval foragers knew that every berry was a wager. Some turned to poison if prepared wrong. Some soured so fast they ruined the whole pot. Yet villagers learned grandmothers teaching granddaughters which leaves to trust, which stems to avoid, which wild yeasts liked elderberry skins best when the air turned cold. Some scholars remain puzzled by just how far these folk methods traveled. Stories linger of mountain peasants in France, forest dwellers in Saxony, lone cottagers in the highlands of England and Scotland, all bubbling wild berry brews under thatched roofs and canopy cover. The orchard was for planning, the hedgerow for secret finds, the wild berry patch for whispered experiments nobody paid taxes on. Lean closer to the simmering pot, steam laced with a sweetness sharper than cider, thicker than spiced ale. No fancy spices here, no cinnamon or ginger from far coasts, just fruit a dash of honey, if luck and hidden hives allowed, maybe a pinch of dried herb to coax the flavor just so. Taste it, and you'd know the season early. Elderberry bright and thin, late bilberry dark, and potent, all carrying the wild stamp of what the orchard never tamed. In some corners, these berry brews found their way to fairs, small jugs swapped for coins, sips traded for gossip, laughter curling under canvas stalls as neighbors pretended not to notice the sharp kick hidden in a single cup. For a village child, a single lick of the stirring spoon might mean sticky lips and a scolding from a mother pretending she'd never done the same. You picture a barrel rolled behind cottage doors, too small to boast of, too precious to share with just anyone. A sip was a gift, a neighbor's kindness, when the well ran dry, a hearth's warmth, when alehouse barrels ran low. And when spring thawed the hedgerows, once more, fresh shoots promised another patch, another risk, another chance to coax sweetness and sharpness into something that made a hard life taste briefly, warmly extravagant. Brush your hands clean of bramble thorns and wipe a streak of purple juice from your cuff. The clearing hums with quiet promise. Branches heavy with next season's risk, bird calls echoing between brambles. No orchard master here, no church scribe counting barrels, just the oldest brewing truth of all. Where something wild grows, something wilder can ferment. Ahead, the forest edges thicken. Under old oak branches, sacred herbs linger, green ghosts of a time when brewing meant more than quenching thirst. Pagan secrets slip into barrels blessed by church hands, proving that no hedge or orchard ever fully tamed the strange companionship between belief and brew. But for now, your lips hum with elderberry warmth, and the bramble path invites you further into secrets that taste sharper than any guild-approved ale ever dared. Follow the bramble path until it opens into a clearing dotted with herbs you'd pass by without a second glance, low stalks swaying in a breeze that tastes faintly of old stories and half-buried rites. Here, brewing slips its roots deeper than orchard fences or hedgerow tricks. Here it tangles with secrets older than church bells and village guilds alike. Step into the hush and crouch near a cluster of mugwort, its feathery tops brushing your fingertips. Once a healer's friend, once a brewer's secret mugwort carried a reputation that slipped between worlds, folk charm, pagan rite, mild hallucinogen, whispered to shape dreams when the nights turned long. Imagine a village woman plucking handfuls at dusk, tucking stems into her apron, alongside yarrow or wild rosemary, destined for a bubbling pot that blurred the line between ale and potion. Some say the church frowned on such herbs, rooted as they were in half-pagan practice and stubborn country memory. And yet old records hint at church-sanctioned brewing that never fully escaped these plants' shadow. A monk's ale might boast hops and barley by the rulebook, but carry a hint of sacred herb slipped in by habit or superstition. Historians still argue whether these additions were superstition taste or quiet defiance. No single record answers the question cleanly. Picture a small tavern table where elders lean close, voices low. They talk of sacred groves long gone, to hedgerow charms buried at crossroads, herbs dried in secret corners. Brewing was never just about thirst. It was warmth against the cold courage before the harvest, a soft chant in a mug when prayers alone seemed too far from the plow lines and bramble trails. Yarrow's feathery crown appears again at your feet. No hops, no exotic spice from distant trade here, just this sharp green promise of bitterness, mild preservation, a whisper of power. In some parts of Europe, Groot ales, unhopped brews, thick with sacred herbs, held ground long after hops took over official recipes. Records of medieval Groot guilds survive in pockets small towns with brewers licensed to gather, blend, and guard the balance of mugwort sweet gale and other half-forgotten plants. You stand, rub a stem between your palms, and taste the faint tang that might linger in a village ale poured during harvest feasts. The sharpness cuts through sweetness, a reminder that brewing wasn't always safe or polite. Too much mugwort turned an evening's warmth into restless dreams. Too little, and the brew soured too soon. Some claim these brews stirred visions or mischief. Others roll their eyes, calling them peasants' tales best left to storytellers by the hearth. Researchers continue to debate whether pagan rites truly lingered in the barrels or whether the taste alone made them legendary. Not all sacred herbs wore pagan cloaks. Some carried church blessings, rosemary to remember the holy dead, rue to ward off sickness. Herbs blessed at candlelit masses and tucked behind barrels to guard a brew's spirit. Medieval villagers weren't purists. They blended old charms with new saints, old herbs with new prayers, hedging their bets like farmers watching the weather. Imagine a harvest fair on the edge of a sacred grove, long since claimed by orchard rows. A hedge separates rows of apples from a patch of mugwort that no plow ever tames. Nearby, villagers lift tankards to lips the taste sharp and faintly wild, their laughter warm enough to hush any lingering worry about what the parish priest might think. Sometimes these herbs slipped into communal brewing, not as rebellion, but as necessity. No hops. Use yarrow. Need a sharper bite. Mugwort. Want a brew that lingered longer on the tongue than plain cider. A pinch of something sacred dried in secret, shared in whispers, from mother to daughter. Some monasteries turned a blind eye so long as tithes were paid, barrels filled, and the wild edge of brewing didn't spill too far into trouble. You move through the clearing, brushing aside grass and bracken. A stone circle peeks through roots, half buried and mossy, a remnant of rites long since turned to village stories. Here you imagine villagers gathering by moonlight, herbs, bundled tight offerings slipped into the hedge to bless the season's next brew. The church might ring bells at dawn, but at dusk the hedgerow always had its own prayers. Bend down once more, tuck a sprig of yarrow into your sleeve, an echo of hands that once did the same when orchard cider soured and the cider mill fell silent. The sacred herbs never vanished. They shifted, had bled, into new recipes. When hops claimed the throne of ale making, these plants crept into hidden corners, folk medicine secret spirits, recipes scribbled in the margins of dusty cookbooks. No orchard fence nor brewing guild could fully strip them from the barrel's memory. Taste an old mug of Groot ale today, if you can find one, and you'll sip centuries of stubborn roots, part herb, part charm, part soft rebellion, brewed under hedgerows, where sacred and ordinary met in a mug that tasted sharper than any sermon. Step back from the clearing, sleeves brushed clean of pollen breath, full of faint bitterness. Ahead, the path winds toward high garden walls, royal grounds, where herbs and exotic plants once grew, not for peasants or pagans, but for kings and queens with feasts to impress. But some secrets slip over walls when no one's watching, roots burrowing deeper than any gardener's tidy plan. Leave the wild hedge and the half-hidden stone circle behind. Now step carefully under the looming walls of a royal garden, where brewing secrets wore silks instead of nettle-pricked sleeves. Here the air shifts sharper, perfumed, patrolled by gardeners, whose job was to coax the impossible from the English damp exotic plants, foreign herbs, fruits, so rare they traveled weeks in wooden crates just to bloom once before the frost. Stand at the iron gate. Beyond rows of trimmed hedges and perfect beds show off everything the orchard peasants never touched: oranges in walled groves, figs trained to crawl across warm brick bitter herbs from distant shores, waiting to be clipped and carried into castle kitchens. This was brewing for the high table, where spices and forbidden plants slipped into goblets that common folk would never taste. Picture a servant bending low in the shadow of the garden's far wall, scissors in hand. A snip here, a leaf pocketed there, lemongrass, or a forbidden sprig of wormwood, rumored to twist the mind if brewed too strong. Some scholars remain puzzled by how such plants made it north, surviving journeys that crushed lesser stems to pulp. And yet here they grow under glass cloches and protective walls, roots sunk in soil, warmed by braziers on bitter nights. Inside the castle, a brewer hunches over a stone jug. He slips a handful of dried orange peel into a vat of ale destined for the queen's winter feast. Sweetness comes from the orchard, still apple must, or pressed pears from a tenant's orchard squeezed as tax payment, but the flavor is lifted by plants no village hedge could nurture. A whiff of saffron or a dash of ginger powder might turn a simple cup into a royal toast. You move through the garden paths, shoes muffled on damp gravel. Lavender tangles by your knee, not the common kitchen sprig, but a cultivated strain bred for deeper scent, used to perfume rooms, and sometimes to slip into fancy ales meant for midnight revels. There is no scholarly consensus on whether these exotic garden brews were daily indulgence or rare spectacle. Some chronicles praise royal alehouses stuffed with spice, while others hint most folk at court still sipped what the villagers did, just with extra sugar stirred in. Imagine the hush of a forbidden harvest, an undergardener tucking seeds into his tunic, hoping to sell them to a village healer when the steward's back is turned. The royal garden's bounty didn't always stay within its walls. Recipes leaked out sometimes by bribes, sometimes by careless gossip at the alehouse where castle cooks traded complaints for a cup of common cider. You stand by a trellis dripping with strange blooms, some for the lord's table, some for the lady's beauty potions, some rumored to slip into a secret brew that eased sleep or coaxed dreams, rich enough to be dangerous. A monk's record, half burned, describes feasts where high-born guests sipped spiced mead laced with herbs once banned by older kings. Did these plants really twist the tongue and mind, or were the rumors half the point Historians still argue parsing old cookbooks, like puzzle boxes, to find scraps of truth buried under layers of royal intrigue. A bee hums past your ear, drawn to a row of exotic blooms near a small pond. Wild hives were for peasants. Here, bees were prized and protected their combs, harvested for honey that might crown a spiced mead poured only once a year. Imagine a goblet lifted in a candlelit hall, velvet sleeves brushing silver platters, sweetness dripped into a brew that carried orchard must, wild hedgerow tang, and garden spice, all in one sip taste, layered like secrets. You brush your fingers along the edge of a stone planter, inside tiny green shoots, push up through dark soil. Maybe it's mint, or barrage, for a refreshing summer ale, or something stranger, a hush-hush plant from southern coasts, guarded more closely than the castle keys. Royal gardeners traded slips and seeds like smugglers, hoping to impress a lord or earn a favor that might outlast a single season's bloom. Not every forbidden plant stayed behind the castle wall. Some slipped back to village hedges when a careless servant dropped seeds in muddy boots, or when a curious brewer bartered a pinch from a traveling monk. These plants took root where they shouldn't have, growing wild along orchard fences, or behind alehouses, feeding rumors that the royal table's taste wasn't so far from the hedge after all. Step away from the planter. The garden hushes behind you, walls closing back around secrets and stolen seeds. Some linger still, an old herb that sprouted where it wasn't welcome a taste on the tongue, that hints of spice and sharpness centuries after the last royal feast ended. Ahead, the forest path returns, leading you away from perfect walls, back to the wild where peasants gather mushrooms and strange ferments flicker to life under the moss. The orchard taught sweetness, the hedgerow survival, but the garden proved that sometimes forbidden flavor is the truest taste of power. Slip from the garden's neat gravel back to the crooked edge of the forest, where paths blur, fences fail, and villagers lean on instincts older than any castle wall. Here brewing turned wild again, tangled up with foragers whose boots sank deep in leaf litter and whose baskets brimmed with finds that never showed up on lordly ledgers. Step under the thick canopy, soft moss underfoot, bark slick with mist. Somewhere ahead, a bent figure lifts a wicker basket to show off lumps of forest treasure mushrooms. For stew, yes, but sometimes, too, for odd ferments that skirted the line between food, drink, and folklore. Imagine a pot set on a hearth, back in a cottage clearing its steam, curling up around a blend of wild yeast caught on mushroom caps and berries bruised during the gathering. Some peasants swore by these forest brews. Elderberry ale was a hedge staple, but throw in a handful of mushrooms, and the taste shifted, deepened, darkened into something closer to a farmhouse stout with an earthy bite. Historians still argue whether these brews were accidents of necessity or deliberate experiments. Did villagers really know how fungi shaped fermentation? Or did they just trust the forest to lend them a barrel's worth of luck? Surviving scraps of local law hint at confusion, not consensus taxmen baffled by drinks that slip between cider ale and wild wine. Crouch by a mossy log. Under it, pale caps sprout in tight clusters. Ink caps, puffballs, the stray parasol mushroom waiting for careful fingers. A grandmother might kneel here at dawn, muttering a charm under her breath, while slipping a few choice pieces into her basket. Not all mushrooms belonged in the cookpot. Some sliced thin, fed the starter mash for a barrel hidden behind the hearth. Picture a village fair on the forest's edge. Barrels rolled out, from wagons, mugs poured, with hush-hush disclaimers about strength and taste. Some sips turned sour fast. Others hit the tongue with a punch that left drinkers flushed and a bit too chatty for the local reeve's liking. There's no scholarly consensus on whether forest-fermented brews carried mind-bending tricks or were just folk myths born from strong drink and stronger stories. But old ballads linger half-sung verses about foragers who found both wealth and madness in mushroom-laced ales. You stand brushing damp soil from your palms. Deeper into the wood, villagers gather wild yeast, where it drifts, naturally caught on berry skins, on flower petals, even on the surface of rotting logs. A good patch could feed a brew that bubbled through the winter, sturdy enough to stretch grain rations or transform leftover orchard fruit into something worth sipping by the hearth. Some families guarded these foraging routes, like treasure, passing them down through generations, each slip of moss and bloom, a promise that no brewer's guild could claim a monopoly on nature's quiet ferment. Imagine a mother dipping a cup into a bubbling barrel behind her cottage. She tastes carefully sharp, earthy tangy, with the memory of pine needles and soft mushroom flesh. A pinch more honey, a dash of dried herbs from last year's hedge. No written recipe guides her hand, just instinct rumor and the forest's stubborn generosity. At the edge of a clearing, a boy tests his luck, scraping lichen from a fallen branch, peering into hollows where he thinks wild yeast sleeps. Some elders scoff, telling him it's folly. Others wink, knowing every proper brew begins with a little mischief and a gamble that wild things might be tamed just long enough to flavor a winter's barrel. Step closer to a stream winding through the trees, its banks dotted with plants half forgotten by orchard keepers and royal gardeners alike. Sweet Gale bog myrtle, maybe a sprig of marsh rosemary herbs that fed old Grood ales when hops were scarce or forbidden by brewing law. A forager might pluck a stem here, another there, slipping them into the same basket as forest fungi and wild fruit. Each piece a note in a brewing chord the forest alone could teach. Some monks called these practices pagan remnants, dangerous, unpredictable proof that peasants clung to old ways long after sermons rang through village squares. Researchers continue to debate whether these wild brews survived because they were tasty or simply because they were free, untaxed, unregulated, impossible to measure or stamp with a guild seal. Yet here you stand, listening to water lap at mossy stones while a basket brims with quiet defiance. There's magic in this mix of leaf and fungus berry and wild yeast. No scroll, no decree, no orchard fence wide enough to keep it out of a barrel. Even today, some modern brewers chase the ghost of these forest ferments wild ales, farmhouse ciders, sour beers that taste of the woods more than the field. You step away from the stream, brushing bracken from your sleeves. The clearing dims behind you, the hush of the forest folding back around its secrets. Ahead, trade roads wait routes that pulled these humble barrels alongside spices, silks, and stories from far-off shores. But deep in your throat lingers a faint tang of wild yeast and forest dusk. Proof that sometimes the strangest brews come not from royal gardens or orchard rows, but from the soft, damp corners where mushrooms glow, wild yeast drifts, and peasants trust the woods to fill their mugs when fields fall silent. Step out of the hush of dripping moss and tangled roots, lift your head to a road that winds far beyond the orchard lanes and village hedgerows you've left behind. Here lie the trade routes' veins that carried spice stories, rumors, and yes, even brewing secrets, folded into caravans that creaked across Europe like wandering taverns on wheels. Stand at the roadside muddy boots pressed into wagon ruts, worn deep by generations of merchants who knew the worth of a sack of cinnamon or a pouch of ginger. For medieval brewers, these routes meant more than silk or coins, they meant flavor warmth, and the soft promise that a sip of local ale could carry a ghost of somewhere far grander than the village green. Picture a sleepy port at dawn. A barrel marked with chalk slips from a deck ropes creaking as dockhands curse the cold. Inside, not wine or hops alone, but tiny bundles of spices wrapped in oilskin to guard their precious tang. Grains of paradise, peppery seeds from West Africa, nutmeg from islands nobody here will ever see. Cloves so pungent they're stored away from flour and cloth to keep them from clinging like rumors. Historians still argue whether these spices were rare luxury or quiet staples by the time they reached the brewing pot. Some records hint that only nobles and monasteries could afford to steep cloves and ginger into ale vats. Yet stray parish ledgers and tavern inventories suggest otherwise small quantities hidden among apples, sacks of barley, and orchard pears, where trade routes spread flavors, followed sometimes official, sometimes smuggled in a wagon's false bottom, when taxes grew too sharp to swallow. Step closer to a market stall, where a brewer haggles over a scrap of cinnamon bark. Coins clink. A merchant winks. Both know the village alehouse will brag about spiced brew by week's-end mugs lifted high at winter fairs to toast a taste that wandered 1,000 miles before landing on a local tongue. Some say these spices mask poor quality ale covered up rough water, stale grain, or hasty fermenting. Some say they made a cold night feel closer to a feast, no matter how thin the purse. Imagine a monastery scribe scratching his quill, recording a list of purchases: hops from a local field, honey from a hidden hive, ginger from Venice, cinnamon from Cairo by way of Genoa. It's easy to think of monks as sober keepers of brewing law, but many were clever traders, guards of secret spice recipes that turned simple ale into something worth serving to bishops or wandering nobles. Researchers continue to debate whether guilds really locked down these blends, or whether half the secret was just rumor to keep the village brewer guessing. Picture a lone peddler trudging the trade road at dusk. In his pack, rattle spices alongside dried fruits, a twist of cloth soaked with rosewater, a story half true about a new herb that might make ale sparkle brighter or last longer in the barrel. He trades a pinch for a meal, sells a pouch for a night's rest in a tavern where local brewers listen close ears, open for a whisper of how to stretch orchard cider into something exotic enough to charge an extra penny a mug. Sometimes the route did more than bring spices. It carried yeast seeds, even slips of new orchard stock tucked into wagon corners, apples bred sweet in France pears from distant Flanders berry cuttings that found their way into hedgerows miles from any port. No border was tight enough to stop an enterprising brewer with a sharp tongue and a cousin in the merchant trade. Step back from the roadside and watch wagons pass. A pack horse bristles under burlap sacks, its driver half dozing, dreaming of the next port, the next coin, the next slip of news worth more than spice. By the time these goods reach your village, they've crossed more stories than any scribe could bind into a single book. Each sip of spiced ale, each swirl of cinnamon in a monk's cellar proof that the world never stayed as small as the orchard fence promised. You breathe in the tang of cold wind, the ghost of distant markets that cling to salt air and caravan dust. Ahead, the path curls back toward local guild halls, places where these wandering flavors found guards more secretive than any customs clerk. But for now, you hold on to the image of a single mug lifted by a village drinker who never left his hedgerow. yet tasted hints of pepper fields, ginger roots, cinnamon trees blooming half a world away. Some spices grew familiar enough to slip into the language grains of paradise whispered into folk tales, ginger trickling into old jokes about monks who sampled too much. And when barrels ran dry, the stories lingered proof that no trade route ever vanished completely. Somewhere a lone merchant always waited with a fresh pouch to keep the brew warm and the village talking. Step off the muddy track boots, crusted with dust from faraway coasts you'll never see. You carry the taste in your mind now. Orchard apples, mellowed by cinnamon honey mead, sparked by ginger heat, sharp hedgerow wine, tamed by cloves so soft they blur the line between sip and dream. And as the road bends toward the brewing guild's closed doors, remember no spice stays secret forever, not when tongues wag faster than wagons roll. Follow the winding trade road into town where the soft clink of coins turns to the quiet hush of doors that close behind secrets. Here stand the brewing guilds, low stone halls or timbered chambers where recipe scraps are worth more than gold, and every spice blend is guarded like a noble's will. If orchards fed the barrel and trade routes spiced the mug, then the guilds shaped who could sip what and at what cost. Step inside. The air is thick with the hum of whispered deals. Apprentices huddle over scratched slates. Elders argue over measurements no outsider will ever see. A barrel rests in the corner, its lid marked with a symbol you don't know. Yet everyone here does a sign that the mix within is not for village gossip. Historians still argue whether these guilds protected tradition or simply fenced flavor for those who could pay. Surviving charters read like small kingdoms' rules for who brews, who buys, who tastes first, who never tastes at all. Picture an apprentice wiping sweat from his brow as he stirs a batch of ale laced with grains of paradise, carefully weighed seeds from trade routes that twist halfway around the known world. If a pinch spills, he'll sweep it up and guard it close. Every grain matters, every taste tested and signed off by a guild master whose name weighs heavier than any lord's writ. Near the hearth, 2 guild elders sip from clay cups, eyes narrowed. The blend must be balanced too sharp, and the customer complains. Too sweet, and the rumor spreads that the guild's lost its edge. Some say these masters held secret tastings in candlelit back rooms, spices portioned in shadows, so no rival brewer could slip in to steal a single sniff. Researchers continue to debate whether the famous spice ales that trickled down to taverns ever truly tasted like what was poured for nobles in the guild hall's back chamber. Step closer to a ledger on a rough oak table. The ink scrawls record more than ingredients, the tax paid to the local reeve, the bribe tucked into a merchant's purse for first pick of this season's cinnamon, the hush money slipped to a porter who forgets which cart carried the ginger root. Each line, a proof that brewing at its finest wasn't just skill, it was power. Not every village brewer bent the knee to the guild. Some slipped herbs from hedgerows into the pot, leaned on secret honey from wild hives, or bartered with smugglers at dusty crossroad inns. But the guild's grip was strong inspectors, checking barrels at fairs, fines for unlicensed ale gossip, spun into fines heavier than any spilled pint. And yet, taste has always been hard to fence. A single sip in the wrong mouth, a loose word at the market, and suddenly a rival alehouse tries to copy what was once locked in a backroom ledger. Imagine a village festival where barrels roll down a cobbled street, guild-marked casks stamped with seals that promise quality no peasant orchard could rival. Lads and maids crowd around the tap, hoping for a taste that brags of cinnamon, from Venice ginger, from Alexandria, a whisper of cloves so rare they'll tell the story for weeks. A penny buys a sip, a silver groat buys a mug, and the guild keeps the recipe hidden all the while. No brewing guild survived alone. They leaned on trade roads and orchard taxes on monks who recorded just enough truth to keep the story half mystery, half boast. Some say they protected communities from bad ale weak drink sickness. Some say they simply locked the barrel so tight that the best flavor trickled only where coin flowed fastest. Scholars remain divided, flipping charters in dusty archives, tracing signatures that prove a recipe was worth war in the right season. Picture a boy sweeping sawdust from the guild hall floor. His ears perk as an elder murmurs the next blend. How much ginger to lift the honey mead? How many grains of paradise to make a lord's winter ale bite just so? One day, that boy might slip a scrap of parchment home, test the blend in his mother's pot. One day, the secret might walk out these guarded doors, in the pocket of a sleeve no master suspects. You stand under the hall's timber beams, catching the warmth of a hidden barrel, aging slow in the dark. Somewhere beyond these walls, orchard branches still bend under fruit, hedgerows rustle with berries, hidden hives hum in meadows unseen. The guild can guard the blend, but never the root. Every flavor here began with a tree, a bramble, a wild chance that no seal or scribbled fine could wholly contain. Step outside again, boots echoing on cold cobbles. The hall doors thud shut, secrets locked behind oak and iron. Ahead, the path narrows to its last bend, a final taste waiting in the hush, where orchard hedge garden forest and guild all fade beneath the heavy footfall of steam engines and bottled factories. The last sip of old botanicals, the hush before the hum of modern brewing, drowns out orchard ghosts forever, unless you listen carefully enough to catch the whisper in the barrel's dark heart. Follow the road past the guild hall's heavy doors, past the last orchard fence, past the hedgerows that clung to secrets for centuries. Step now into the final bend, where the world begins to hum, with gears, smoke, and steel barrels that shine brighter than any mossy cider press ever could. This is the last sip of medieval botanicals, the quiet fade of flavors born under crooked trees and thatched roofs, erased one cask at a time by the relentless promise of progress. Stand at the edge of a village lane that doesn't quite know it's becoming a town. In the distance, you hear the grind of a new brewery, larger than any guild hall cellar, its vats taller than the church spire. Men in thick aprons feed coal into brick furnaces, steam coils through iron pipes, and copper tanks hiss like kettles, too big for any cottage hearth. The orchard still blossoms beyond the hedgerow, but its fruit is no longer picked by barefoot children for backyard presses. It's weighed, sold, and poured into machines that care nothing for hedge-stitched dreams. Some villagers stand watching the first barrels roll from factory floors, casks stamped not with secret guild marks, but bold iron brands that promise uniform tastes, safer storage, and longer shelf life. No mugwort tucked in a healer's apron, no hedgerow berry hidden under bramble thorns, just hops, barley, yeast, measured by the pound, steam polished into the same steady sip year after year. Historians still argue whether this was triumph or tragedy. Did industrial brewing rescue common drinkers from spoiled batches and risky herbs? Or did it scrub away the tang of centuries, stripping the wildness from the barrel's heart? Picture a former orchard keeper, leaning on his gate watching new wagons roll past. Once he sold medlars, sloes, windfall apples, whatever the orchard's crooked rows could give. Now the factory wants only grain in bulk fruit, pressed by modern mills, or discarded altogether for faster, cleaner fermenting. His old trees stand half forgotten at the hedge's edge, branches heavy with fruit, too soft to bother collecting, when a single trainload of barley feeds 1,000 kegs more cheaply than orchard rows ever could. Step into the new brew hall. Copper vats gleam under gas lamps. Clerks scratch numbers into ledgers thicker than any monk's recipe book. Taste testers swirl pints by the line, sniffing for sourness that never comes every batch as safe as the last. Every bottle sealed tight to cross counties without losing its shine. There's no room here for a wild hive's sweetness, a hedgerow's tang, or a forest's soft mischief. The taste is clear, crisp, predictable, and to some heartbreakingly silent. Some factory owners brag about progress. No more spoiled barrels, no more peasant hedges bristling with untaxed fruit, no more herbal pouches hidden under floorboards. Researchers continue to debate how fast local flavors vanished. Did they trickle out overnight or linger in small villages that clung to backyard presses and secret recipes long after steam whistles called shift workers to dawn shifts? Imagine a grandmother, hunched by her hearth, a single barrel behind the door, fruit wine or sharp cider pressed from the last windfalls nobody bothered to sell. A few neighbors come by on a winter night, sip the old taste whisper stories of hedgerow hunts and hidden hives. They know this flavor might not last another generation, but for tonight, it lingers sweet, sharp, stubborn, in the shadows, while the factory's roar hums through the fields. Step outside the brew hall and stand in the lane as the factory whistle blows. Workers spill into the dusk boots, clattering over cobbles where orchard soil once clung to cartwheels. In a nearby hedge, a sloe bush still clings to its blue-black fruit. A boy plucks one curious. His grandmother taught him how to taste its sour bite, a ghost of a brewing world he may never truly know. There's no scholarly consensus on whether these final orchard ghosts ever really vanished. Some say the old trees wait half wild at the edge of new fences. A few craft brewers, restless dreamers, slip a handful of mugwort into small batches, press forgotten meddlers, just to taste what the past once promised. The flavor never quite matches the village barrel or the cottage hearth, but the echo is there tart, earthy, flickering under layers of stainless steel and perfect temperature controls. You lift an invisible mug one last time, taste the orchard's rot, soft sweetness, the hedgerow's sharp surprise, the healer's dried herbs, the spice from a caravan chest, the wild yeast drifting through forest mist. You swallow, and the steam engine's rattle on barrels roll smoother. Taste grows safer, and a tiny crooked orchard at the world's edge hums quietly in the dark, waiting for the curious to find its fruit again. Step back, lantern light flickering behind you. Listen close. The hush of old brewing secrets still drifts in the wind through brambles, orchard rows, hidden hives, and cellar walls that never quite forgot. And if you dream sweetly tonight, maybe you'll taste it just once more before the factory's hum lulls the world to sleep. So now, as the last traces of orchard mist curl around your thoughts, let your breath soften and settle. In the hush that follows the press and the barrel, the bramble and the hive, the roads and the roaring steam, all that remains is a warm ghost of taste, sweet, where it should have rotted sharp, where it should have dulled, stubborn as any village secret. Imagine the orchard at dawn, bare branches dripping with frost hedgerow berries, dusted with quiet promises. Somewhere, a barrel still bubbles in the dark, carrying stories you've nearly forgotten, but never fully lost. Let it go for tonight. Let the hum of distant trains and new engines fade behind the rustle of orchard leaves. Let the past linger sweet and sour on your tongue as you drift deeper into rest. If you'd like to taste tales like these again, well, you know where to find me, softly waiting in your half-sleep. And before you drift off, completely, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? What little lost brew should we sip next? Just you and the past.